ready for that. I'm gonna be watching.
Exercise.
I won't. I'll wake up later.
Play.
I'll know the night before, maybe. And
Play what?
If there's two on each side.
Yeah, that would be better.
Well,
Playing
it wouldn't
two?
be anything. We're playing two. We're playing with insurance.
See, I've played.
Everybody, all these older folks, they don't run around as much because they figured out how to slice the ball.
Oh, yes.
And of course, so I'm running around trying to hit all the slicing with everything. And the last game, I took one step back. It doesn't feel
I'm
so
glad
bad.
you.
Well, my theory is, I'm not gonna break anything, I'm not gonna make myself fall, so I'm not aggressive.
That's, yeah, I'm just not always able to overcome that in the moment, when it's time for a win. So I try to be able to control myself.
Used to play like that.
Steelers.
I was
Yeah.
just to make sure I had a couple of things really down. He used all the angles, he used all the sections.
You got it. Don't bother me. Yep.
Yeah. And he never ran, because he says, I don't have to. I know if I lose that point, I'm gonna get 5 or 6 next points on my serve or something, so I don't run. And he would kill it all the time.
All right, I'd like to call to order the Finance and Facilities Committee meeting of November 26th and start off with item 1.02, a live streaming announcement. Meetings of the Mechanicsburg Area School District Board of Directors are being recorded and live streamed for the purpose of transparency and increased public access. The live stream, along with recordings from previously held meetings, can be found on the school board's YouTube channel. On to new business, item 2.01, auditorium change order, high school. Mr. Longwell? Take it away.
Dr. Bitts will take
Dr. Bitts, take it away.
Yeah.
You made eye contact
Sorry
with me
about
first.
that.
Don't do that.
So this one has changed in shape even a little bit since we put it on the agenda for discussion tonight. So long story short, we are not prepared yet tonight to present a final recommendation for the auditorium change order because we got the final numbers and details, and we need to be able to feel better about it before we bring it forward. So I'll leave it at that for the auditorium change order, but I will share a little bit more. Ultimately, the first chunk of the change order, which was the lesser amount, which by policy we were able to begin moving forward on, looks fantastic. The paint job, the carpet, it has definitely transformed into a space that we are proud of, and it's going to be great. But the next piece to it, which is really finishing off the trim and the final aspects to it, just don't feel quite strong enough about it yet to be able to come forward as we're hoping to tonight and be able to say, this is it, we're ready to go. So it's okay. The status of it right now, with some additional cleaning to be able to get all the seats professionally cleaned, we'll have it in a place where it'll be ready for the musical and the winter concerts and all those kinds of things. And then we'll be able to come back to the board at a future meeting to have a firm answer on how do we finalize it and finish it off, and then be able to have it completed after the musical season, which would be the beginning, middle of March. And that way we can have that final trim finished before the spring concert season, which comes in April and May. So we're comfortable with where things at, but what we were hoping to maybe finalize tonight, just not a place to be able to do that. So.
It's a tight window in between the musical and the spring concerts to,
Yeah.
put that in between.
Well, musical's the last week of February, very beginning. It's actually, I think, the 27th, 28th, something like that. And then we'll have a few weeks, and ultimately, because of everything that's already been done, the final trim work and things shouldn't take a great deal of time. So we feel pretty comfortable with it.
Is that, I don't remember, is that purely in the front, or is there also trim coming back the side?
It's largely in the front, but there's a little bit of trim work just to where the two parts of the wall, there's kind of the lower part of the wall and then the upper part of the wall. There's a little bit of trim work that carries through, but it's more just like
Molding.
Mold, like,
thank you.
yeah.
Yes.
Wainscoting and molding. But the bulk of it's then around the
Correct.
stage.
And the front of the stage. So we'll get that tightened up and have that begin soon.
Okay. Well, then we will revisit that hopefully later. So move on to item 2.02, HVAC upgrades Mechanic Middle School. Dr. Bitts, Mr. Longwell.
This one I will.
Please.
Sorry, I will take this one. Mrs. Lead is here from Crabtree Rohrbaugh this evening, and so I'll step through the presentation, and then Kelsey will help fill in any gaps that I may miss, but also available for questions as they come up. And so tonight we wanted to come back to the board and really talk about a project at the middle school, one that in the spring we had applied for a grant. And so how can we utilize a facilities improvement grant to address certain mechanical, electrical, and plumbing needs at the middle school is kind of the question, essential question, if you will. And really that leads us to how we got to this point. And so if the board recalls, we had our facilities planning committee that developed a list of recommendations. We prioritized that list, and we continue to use that list as a roadmap of sorts to say, what are some bigger facility projects that exist in the school district? What's the timing of them? How are we going to fund them? And then, frankly, the order of them. And so as we looked at that priority listing of projects this past spring, there was a grant that came available, as we had talked, probably maybe a board update, I think, because there was a small window open. We wanted to participate. We got our engineer to help us look at the project list, say which one of these looked the most viable, because it also was a competitive grant. And so we wanted to try to put our best foot forward, knowing there was not a lot of money going to go around, maybe 175 million, I think, for 500 school districts. And out of the 500 school districts, I think a appreciable number of them applied. I know even at RIU, we kind of took an informal poll among our colleagues, and I think 2/3 of the room raised their hand and said they were applying. And so we were going into it wanting to receive some money, but also knowing it was going to be pretty competitive. Really where we landed though was we thought the middle school project for an HVAC upgrade, because that was already on our prioritized listing, and we felt that given the nature of the project, the age of the building, the condition of it, we felt like that was probably our most competitive project to submit. And we were already planning to do it anyway at some point in the nearer future, I'll say. So we applied for the grant. We were fortunate to receive $1 million as part of that process through the Commonwealth Financing Agency, but also administered through DCED, Department of Community and Economic Development. And so that project, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go here, but ultimately getting some funding to support a HVAC project at the middle school. And in terms of the price, the estimated costs, this is what we had submitted to the state as part of that grant application. It was a project that came in at an estimated $3.5 million, and you can see a couple elements of this project. First, the HVAC in the building network closets, and so we've done this in all of our other projects as we've gone through. Those network closets have critical technology. They have switches, they have equipment for our phones, different other things, and so maintaining a good temperature control in there is important. And so this was something Mr. Fairball, our technology director, had brought through a request anyway, and we felt like this could be part of a larger conversation about our HVAC in that building. And then we have the reality that the building was completed back in the early 2000s, and the HVAC equipment was approaching 25 years of useful life. And so we knew, back to some of the conversations we had with the board about all of our buildings, we try to maximize the useful life of our mechanical systems, our roofs, those things. But we also try to be conscious that we don't stretch it so far that they become problems and are constantly breaking down and impacting what's happening in the classrooms and the buildings. And so we knew this was getting, in terms of useful life, to a point that it was going to need to be addressed. And so you can see the HVAC replacement is 2 rooftop units, boilers, chillers, pumps. We're going to refurbish the cooling tower, upgrade building controls, and then also electrical upgrades to support the HVAC installation. And so that's $3.5 million of total project cost. In terms of funding sources, this is something that we've looked at internally with Dr. Bitts, myself, Mrs. Ely, we've talked about the track, we've talked about the stair tower, we've talked about this, and so how does all that fit together in terms of the larger picture? And so an element of the conversation is the grant that we've received, the $1 million, but also the district sources of where are we at with our construction project as the high school is nearly substantially complete. Excited to say here we are in November, and that's just around the corner. We have some remaining funds in our debt service fund that had accrued there years and years ago that we knew at some point we would consolidate with our capital reserve fund and available for facilities, and feel like it's a good time to do that. And so this might be a little bit small, I apologize, but I tried to fit it all on, on one page. It's kind of a sources and uses, if you will, accounting reconciliation. And so in terms of the projects, we thought it would be good to go back and look at. We've already talked about the track, which is $2.5 million. The stair towers we talked about in a previous meeting at $3.5 million, and then the HVAC upgrades at $3.5 million. And so that totals $9.5 million. And so really then trying to create a roadmap of, well, how are we planning to fund these projects? And in terms of funding, we have the $1 million grant that we received, which we're excited about, to get $1 million toward that $3.5 million project. We have construction funds that we anticipate in working with Dr. Andrew and Mrs. Ely, that probably as we close out the high school project and all of our other projects, and we close out all of our contingencies, you know, the sequence of all the borrowings and paying all of the projects off and truing everything up, probably around $4.5 million remaining. Debt service funds about 3.2, and then we use a little bit of our capital reserve fund at $750,000 to fund the balance. And so you can kind of see how we're able to reconcile the total cost of the projects that we have on the docket that we've been talking about with the board, but also how we're funding them in terms of our cash reserves for the grants that we have available.
Let's mention something real quick, Mr. Longwell. So another way to think about that remaining construction funds is basically out of that final $10 million borrowing that we made, we anticipate there being $4.5 million left out of that final borrowing.
Yep. That's a good way to put it. And so as Dr. Bitz shared, we've been borrowing incrementally along the way for all of our projects. And so all of the bond funds have been paying, you know, different elements of the project. And so as we've closed out all the projects, we've gotten down to the high school, we had borrowed that last 10 million, knowing that what was ever left would help us with this facility planning conversation. And so I would actually maybe affirm the board's decision to continue in that way. As we continue to close out the high school project, we knew we had that last borrowing of 10 million. And so we stayed the course with that 10, knowing that we were closing out our other projects, closing out the high school, and that any money remained would just help us with this facility improvement conversation. Because ultimately what we also want to be careful of is we have our capital reserve fund, which you can see $750,000 is listed there, but we want to be conscious about how we manage that capital reserve fund, because we know we have some other projects from our facilities planning committee that over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years that we want to have some conversations about with the board. And so being intentional about addressing 3 priority areas here, you know, this summer, but then also, you know, mapping out what does, you know, the next 3 to 5 years look like with our capital reserve fund and maybe some other projects that might exist.
It wasn't that we had extra from the borrowing. The projects that are there at the top were contemplated the whole time. We've talked about this multiple times. I think that's what you were both saying anyway, but one of the words I was like, it wasn't just found money. It was that we knew they were there. It was that the projects themselves had to come in to a better estimate, right? But we knew it was somewhere in this ballpark, which is why I think this, it matches up pretty well with what we have. So.
And I think it's a good point you make. I think really it was a little bit of, we were coming off of a 7 or 8 year plan of incremental borrowing all along the way, and so we were tracking all the project costs. We had all the borrowings along the way, and we're transitioning into the facilities planning conversation, and so it's kind of putting all those puzzle pieces together. And so that was our goal with this reconciliation, was to say we're really closing the book on all of our current construction projects, I'll say, and the borrowings. And as we look at whatever monies are left, here's the pockets of reserves we have. We know these 3 projects are priorities and what we'd like to pursue with the board, but ultimately recognize that we're not really taking a deep dive into our capital reserve fund with any of these 3, and that will provide us some opportunity to continue to look at some other needs as we move forward.
So that will be all of the remaining construction funds then. Beyond that, there's no more.
Yeah, so the construction funds, we would, that would be net of, that's a good question. So we would have closed out all the elementary projects, we've closed out the high school projects. So that net number is that here as we're standing in November, we're, barring something significantly happening here in the next 2 or 3 weeks, knock on wood.
Better ask Santa.
Yeah. That we feel like the high school project has gone very well, and frankly, so did all of our elementaries. And so, in some ways, I think this is also a credit to kind of the management team that we had, with Mr. Kastner, Dr. Van Drew, Mr. Harris, Mr. Hoffman. Mrs. Ely supported the process in the background as well from a financial standpoint, but managing that construction in an efficient manner and the change order processes at the end of the day helped us when we got to this point in time where it's like we're going to true up all the costs of construction and debt and borrowing and what's left.
I was gonna say, you did a well done job, scooping up all the money that's left to pay for what we have to do yet. So without having to go and, or ask us to borrow more money, so I'm very impressed, so thank you. I feel like we get them almost for free.
So again, very well planned out would be the way I would think of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Ronald, since we have a couple minutes, the public school facility improvement grant,
Yeah.
like with where the state is with PlanCon and all that, like, why does this exist? Where did this money come from? Like, what's the purpose? I was just curious on.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think, in the background, and especially, I know we have a veteran board, but just as I think about it and walk down memory lane, the PlanCon process existed into like the early 2010s, and they put a moratorium on it. And so some schools hurried up and tried to get projects in the pipeline. At my prior district, we did that. Then the moratorium existed for a while. There was a budget holdup probably around 2016 or 17, I want to say. And because that budget at the state level got held up, they accidentally let the moratorium lapse and it opened the window again for PlanCon, which was still on the books. So in this tiny little window, I think something like 25 projects got submitted. 5 of them were ours. And so that was kudos to the good Dr. Lady and Dr. Van Drew. That was a nice, taking opportunity of an open window. So then the moratorium, since then, they've really kept it, clamped in place. To your point, I think what's happened is, so since all of that has happened, a number of years, a decade or more has probably, transpired or lapsed, and the state recognizes that the schools need to do something around school improvement and grants, facility improvement and grants. I think this was an opportunity that they wanted to try to address some facility projects that are out there and get some money to schools to help with projects. I think unfortunately the reality is the demand is so high because they have probably north of 10 years worth of not funding a program. They kind of inserted like a 1-year bucket of money that you can apply for competitive grants through CFA and DCED, which is kind of unique as well because usually that stuff would run through PDE or some of the other arms of government, but through the kind of this competitive grant process, we were able to get that $1 million, and so did some other school districts. It's interesting when you look at the list of who was awarded and who wasn't, but ultimately I think we were fortunate for what we were ultimately awarded. Maybe to the final piece of your question, it was a 1-year, as far as I understand, kind of the state had put it into one of their budgets. There's not a guarantee that it's going to repeat. I mean, maybe they will reauthorize it again in a future form, but I think the state's still got to wrestle with how do they help support local school districts in their facility upgrades, because I think there's some real needs out there at a state level or regional level even.
I think there was a similar pot of money that was distributed simply to municipalities.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, municipalities, and I think it's interesting to your point, I think they have a combined listing. So if you ever go back and look at the combined listing, you'll see there's municipalities on there, there's school districts on there, and so
There's monies that were proposed by somebody and actually went through the legislative budgeting process in this budget year. It's interesting.
And I think, go ahead.
It's the PlanCon, where we get reimbursed a certain percentage of the construction fees. We haven't really received any money for years, have we?
So we're getting them as part of our elementary projects, but the high school project we didn't get it into that window. It was our elementaries that we really had gotten into the window, and the 5 were everything but Elmwood, were the 5 that we had gotten into that
So
process.
have we received money back from them yet,
So,
or they're still reviewing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're going through the PlanCon process, and if you remember all those PlanCon submittals that we were making, I think we're through the pipeline with a lot of those at this point.
Each has a part name, part A, part B, part C, part C.
And as Dr. Bitch shared, as you get through like the parts of they get on out in there until J and so forth, now you're getting into like the debt reimbursement. And so we do that, we do look at that as part of the budget process. So when we pay annually on the debt service for those projects, we get back a little bit of a reimbursement associated with it. Because we've gone, to Dr. Fitz's point, through each of those parts, like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, I think it goes all the way up to K maybe.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
The other thing I wanted to mention here, timeline-wise, I think this came up in a prior meeting, I wanted to make sure I addressed it, was we have a window of time here to address it, and I think that gets a little bit into some of the next slides. The grant can be used effectively if we're doing it as a summer project, which we have to take the building offline to do it. To do it within the grant period, we have to do it either summer of 25 or summer of 26. And so that leads us then to a little bit of a conversation about the possibility of combining the stair tower project and the HVAC upgrades. And so we had received authorization from the board to bid the stair tower project. Mrs. Need has been helping lead that effort. Our plan is to release that bid in December. And so we wanted to come alongside Crabtree, and so Dr. Betts and I and Ms. Seeley had asked some questions about, is it possible to marry these up? Kelsey went back and looked with Mr. Kastner, Mr. Hoffman, kind of the entire team to say, can we marry these projects together and bid them simultaneously to kind of bid it as one project rather than two projects? And it looks like we're able to do that. And so our goal on this trajectory is to have the conversation with the board. If we feel there's support for it, we would like to bring it back for the board's consideration at the December board meeting and receive authorization to bid the project. And then our plan would be to combine the projects into one, because really from our view, the larger project may generate some increased contractor interest. There's also a coordination element with one set of contractors instead of having two sets of contractors, because as the board knows, we have each of our construction projects, you have to have primes, and so you have to have a general contractor, a plumbing contractor, an HVAC contractor, an electrical contractor. So rather than have potentially 8, we can probably get down to 4-ish. And then economies of scale, some potential savings in terms of mobilization, administration of the project. Because there is a grant associated with it, we'll have to take a few extra steps to make sure the bid can be broken out in a way that shows how much of it was the HVAC project and the grant and that, but we've been having some conversations about that.
Can you really get economies of scale like with, it seems like 2 contractors, right? Like the stair tower contractor is not also installing the HVAC unit, and the HVAC unit person is not putting the brickwork on the front of the stair tower, right?
Yeah, but there are elements of the stair tower project that will include, because we'll be over the threshold for a single prime contract within the state as far as the construction cost. In lieu of that trade, the prime trade, we'll have to bid it as a multi-prime anyway, the stair tower. So you'll have a little bit of electrical, a little bit of HVAC, split out across that stair tower project. So I think the view was bringing that additional electrical work, HVAC work to that would make that a little more robust.
Because you don't,
contracts for.
sorry, I mean, because you don't actually, we don't actually have to put air conditioning in the stairs per se. Like, you open them up and it might fit with the ventilation that's in there. So the idea of having a sub just for that might be silly when you would have this bigger project that they could claim to be the HVAC contractor overall, the whole thing, and
Right.
be more. Okay, I understand that.
I think it's a good question, Ray. And I think in fairness, you're right. The projects don't marry up. They're not identical side by side, but there probably are elements of each project where one set of primes, like there'll be some electrical work in both projects. There'll be some, probably, I know there's some steel reinforcement we need for the HVAC, but there'll be some steel work alongside the stair tower. And so some savings, probably not, but in fairness, not.
Well, I get what you're saying. The threshold thing makes sense then too.
So that kind of leads us to a proposed timeline, and so with the board's support, we'd like to move this to consideration at the December board meeting, and then if receiving that authorization, we would plan to release it as a combined project in December, really then coming back probably at the January Finance and Facilities or work session would be our goal, and then getting a February board approval, which would then allow us time to kind of begin to break some ground, get procurement rolling, and then really do a lot of the work over the summertime. I think that probably bears some explanation. The reason March on, there's procurement, but there's also the stair towers themselves can have some work in the courtyard. And so that's something we've talked with Mr. Yuan about, trying to coordinate. That won't impact what's happening in the buildings because they can start to build the external, the towers and the structures. Now over the summer, that's where they'll really have to start to tie everything back in together, and kind of make the connections. And so we would view taking the middle school probably offline. We've talked a little bit about that with Dr. Bitts and the administrative team. The middle school probably has to come offline just because of the nature of the work that's going to be done over the summer over there.
So you think everything will be 100% done by end of August?
The start of August, well, the end of August for the start of school, I think is probably the best way to say that.
That's the plan.
Do we believe the impact of taking the building offline in the summer? I know there's stuff that happens there in the summer. Are we okay sending that to the other?
Yeah, it certainly helps that the high school will be fully online, which we haven't had as the case for the last several summers. So that'll open up a number of opportunities there in addition to obviously the elementary building. So it'll cause some things to move from where they've perhaps gotten comfortable over the last summers, but we can certainly make it happen. It actually gives us the added opportunity. Our facilities staff has been talking for a few summers about how the middle school, because of all the activities that happen there over the summer, is often the last to be cleaned. So not that it doesn't get a thorough cleaning, but they definitely are moving quickly as school is approaching and trying to help teachers get back in their rooms. So if the building is completely offline, it actually gives us a chance to maybe touch up on some regular maintenance kinds of stuff that typically they're zipping through at the end of the summer, and now they can take their time through it.
Things that our facilities department would have.
Correct, yes, yeah, just the regular floor waxing and cleaning and all those kinds of things.
It sounds like fun with no AC on in the summer in the building.
Good use.
I have one more question.
Oh, yeah.
You talk about replacing 2 units.
Mm-hmm.
Is that replacing the HVAC in the whole building, or are there 18 more units that have to be replaced after that?
It's more than 2.
Yeah, I think there's, I want to say 10, but that might
say
be, quote me
8.
on that. There's not even half of them. The 2 will take care of.
And I think it has to do with, the details on that slide might have more to do with the type, not to get so far in the weeds, but there's like different types of rooftop units. And again, I'm even out a little bit outside, my lane here. Mr. Hoffman will correct me later probably, but, so this is a package will address the entire HVAC, I think, at the middle school is the goal.
We'll address the whole system, but there's only so many RTUs versus handlers, I believe is.
Right, I do believe there's more than 2 rooftop units. However, replacing the chiller and the, all the backbones of what feeds those rooftop units and helps support is being replaced. So like, you can think of it as like the heart of the system being replaced. And then the rooftop units is kind of a spine off of that. So, yes.
So replacing this, let me ask this question in a different way. Does this address the HVAC issues at the middle school, or is this addressing a third of the HVAC issues at the middle school that we will need subsequent work on HVAC units in subsequent summers?
This will address as a package what we saw as needed in the next 3 to 5 years from the facilities planning list, because that was some of our view of it, was to apply the totality of the grant was to apply for the project that we were seeing anyway on the list and to advance that.
Is there anything else we need to discuss with this? Go with the timeline, move forward? All right. That concludes this committee meeting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Thank you, Kelsey.
I'd like to call to order the November 26, 2024 work session. I'd like to announce that the meetings of the Mechanicsburg Area School District Board of Directors are being recorded and live streamed for the purpose of transparency and increased public access. The live stream, along with recordings from previously held meetings, can be found on the school board's YouTube channel. Move on to item 3, Budget and Finance, item 3.01, General Fund Budget, Revenue and Expense Trends. Mr. Longwell.
All right. Budget season, I was going to say is upon us, but I think the budget season has probably become a year-long process for us. And I think I probably shared in some prior updates for the board, this is the time of the year where we're working in 3 years. And so if I get them confused at all, just bear with me. I think I got it pretty well straight. But we're closing out the 23-24 school year, which ended in June 30th. And so we were working on the audit. As part of that audit, we're actually going to bring forward some fund balance recommendations, which actually is on the agenda for later tonight. So there's that 23-24 where we get a good look at our most recently completed last full year. And then we're in the 24-25 year, where here we are toward the end of November now, not quite halfway through the school year, but we have a pretty good view of what's happening in the budget and what trends exist and what's going well, or what are some pressures that are signals for us that, hey, we need to maybe take a little closer look at these things as the budget development process unfolds. And then we're also in the midst of then developing the budget for the 25-26 school year. And so as we've shared in prior conversations with the board, particularly when we looked at the budget development calendar, we have a very thorough process, over 40 cost center presentations, administrators, teacher leaders, that speak into our budget process, and that's happening November, December, January, heading into February, and then ultimately our goal is to bring the board a final budget proposal in March at a 2-part meeting to look at revenue and expense. I would say as part of the budget development process, probably a key part of the budget development process is also just seeing what are the trends, the most significant trends in revenue, the most significant trends in expenses, and coming to the board and talking about that. And so this evening, as we've kind of wrapped up our audit, we're in a good place to kind of reflect on some trends. What did we see through 23-24, and then even some commentary, a little bit of what are some previews for what do we see coming into the budget process here as we head to the March budget presentations. So in terms of the trends, real estate taxes, earned income tax, interest income, and state subsidy are some revenue trends that we plan to look at this evening with the school board. I would share that those 4 revenues make up a significant portion of the budget, and so as we've discussed, even the first 2 alone are probably north of $60 million of our approximate $100 million budget. Interest income, that's probably a little, my statement's maybe a little misrepresented. That one's the anomaly, the outlier, but real estate taxes, earned income tax, and state subsidy are probably our 3 of our biggest revenue line items, and we'll talk about that as the presentation goes. In terms of expenses, we'll talk a little bit about benefit expense and what are some trends we're seeing there. No budget presentation is a budget presentation without some conversation about PSERS, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Some trends in special education and student services, and then finally, PA charter schools, just a revisit of where we're at with charter schools, some trending, and some conversation about what we're seeing in terms of expense. I think this chart's probably in many of our budget conversations, but I think it's a great reminder to help frame our conversation, but also talk, tell our story a little bit with the public. We are a school district that's funded 74% through local sources, 25% through state, and 1% through federal. I think the piece I like to point out is a couple things, I think, this year maybe. The federal funding at 1% is such a small sliver of the pie, but then it comes with probably more compliance requirements than the rest of the 99%, combined. And that's the reality of, the title grants and IDEA and our food service funding and those things. I think the other thing is an acknowledgement that, and this is not a political statement at all, but I know there's just some rumblings about what's happening with the Federal Department of Education and funding, and I know there's a lot of questions out there. I would just say at this point, it's something we're monitoring. I know the professional organizations are monitoring, what's happening, and as we go through the budget process, we will just continue to track what's going on with the federal grants and what can we expect to put in the budget, and we will just plan accordingly at that point. In terms of real estate taxes, this is our assessed value, and so this chart is not representative of the tax revenue itself, rather it's the assessed value from which the tax revenue is derived. And so said another way, I think what this chart helps maybe explain or show is we are a growing school district and we know that, but assessed value is continuing to grow, and that's part of the reason real estate taxes is continuing to grow. And so real estate taxes grows, you know, when you raise taxes, but it also grows as a function of the growth of your district. And so the bar chart shows the assessed value of the school district, the totality of it. And then the line graph there, the line that you see running through is showing you the percentage of assessed value that's growing. And so really you can equate that, the percentage, to real estate taxes generally grows, the revenue from it generally grows by 1% or 2% a year, depending on the year you're looking at. I know there's a couple outliers there, based on assessed value growth. And so those are things that we track. We get monthly reports from the county. We're incorporating that into our budget process so that we know here's what we can expect in terms of real estate tax revenue. Earned income tax revenue. So this one, you can see probably pre-pandemic was pretty steady line. If you kind of draw a line through there, a straight line through there, I think you could chart out a line of best fit. And generally, we were growing at 3, 4, 5% per year, year-over-year growth. And that 3, 4, 5% was pretty consistent with what was happening at the state level, what was happening regionally. I think then you can see 21, 22, 22, 23. Those 2 years had grown by probably 10, 12% each year, respectively. It's flattened back out in 23, 24, and so we saw that trend. It did increase, as you can see, but it increased more like 4% instead of the 10 or 12% that we had seen in the prior 2 years. And so this is, again, another trend that we track. It's one of our biggest revenue line items, probably our second biggest. And so we track, again, we get reports monthly. We're comparing year-over-year growth. We're saying what does the growth look like? Because that impacts ultimately how we end this year for 24, 25, but then that trend then impacts what happens in 25, 26. And so we trend forward to see what's happening in the current year, and then we trend forward to get an estimate for 25, 26.
So do you have any idea as to why that dropped off a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in talking with our colleagues at the school district level, they've seen similar trends, that it's leveled off. I think probably my guess, and it could be for one reason or another, I like to look at earned income tax as a little bit of an indicator of what's happening with wages, because it's a wage-based tax. And so one could assume if earned income tax has grown by 4%, then probably the wage base has grown by 4% versus like say 10 or 12%. And I think the job market is probably a part of that. Now, why? I think you can see the economy, the interest rates. There's probably a lot that feeds into that. That's probably a complex answer.
Well, it's also fair to say that at the moment, it appears that the 21, 22, 22, 23 were the anomalies here, because so far this school year, we're trending back towards that historic norm that we saw last year of 3 to 4% rather than the 10 to 12% we saw in those 2 years.
Yeah. And I think Dr. Bitts makes a good point, and that ultimately will inform our budget process, because we're going to go back and say, in this current year, 24, 25, now that the trend is coming back down to more normal levels, what's that mean for 24, 25, just so we can get a good estimate, and that'll ultimately impact our estimate then for 25, 26, because we're seeing that kind of reset, if you will.
So you don't plan to just use the averages that are there at the bottom to say next year, based on a 10-year average, we can assume a 5% growth in EIT?
Yeah, I would say EIT, we generally have budgeted more conservatively around 4 or 5% a year. There were a couple of exceptions there in 21, 22, 22, 23, where we could see, because say when we were preparing the 22, 23 budget, we could already see in 21, 22 that 12% growth was evident even in the winter months, because we were halfway through. And so we factored that in probably to those calculations. But I would say as a whole, like in my 15 years of kind of creating budgets, I would trend more toward what that regional state average is at 3, 4, 5% per year based on the averages we're seeing. And so that's typically the conversation we have around budget time.
So the statewide average is the Act 1 number. and and that's what you use to figure this out. That's part of what goes into your
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah, the wages that does impact the Act One. There's also in the IFO, the Independent Fiscal Office for the state. They monitor budget, and they also publish just like where wages are in total. And so there's a couple different data points to your point. Wage growth is a factor of Act One. I think it's a good point. I think the IFO releases some estimates, and so we kind of look at all of that taken together with what are we seeing in our monthly reports, month over month, to try to develop some estimates around where do we head with earned income tax. I think it's a good point also in that we don't want to overreach. You know, we saw a couple of years of 10 and 12%. The answer probably isn't to budget 10 or 12% because we can even see it's already flattened out at 4%. And so that all of that will inform ultimately where we land in terms of 25, 26 proposal.
So why, okay, if this past year is 4%, which is more norm, why did we have 10 to 12% the last 2 years?
Mm-hmm.
Hot job market.
Yeah, I
We're
think
making more money.
Yeah, I think that's was probably the answer to Mr. Sanker's point. I think you did see companies giving big bonuses, and you saw companies making significant adjustment to their wages. They were trying to be competitive in those years. I would say were some of the years where it was very hard to recruit people, and businesses were getting more and more aggressive in the labor industry, not labor industry, the labor market, if you will, to entice employees. And I think that's representative of what was going on there. Where, not to say it's completely cooled off, but I'd say we've more returned to normal based on where we're at now. This one's an interesting one, interest income. And so you can see pre-16, 17, pretty low. Started to come back around up to about the pandemic, and then really dipped down. And then since then has rebounded pretty significantly. And so about 800,000 in 22, 23, a little over $1.4 million, $1.5 million in 23, 24. This is another one kind of back. I think Mr. Sanker made a good point about budgeting for EIT, but I think it speaks to like budgeting philosophy in general when it comes to revenue. We don't usually chase the outliers in the revenue side of the budget, you know, and so that's very nice that it's $1.5 million. We're probably not going to adjust interest income to $1.5 million for 25, 26 because I think, you know, you see the Fed, they're already cutting rates, and I know that's Mr. Sanker's world, but you can see the interest rates are starting to come down a little bit. And so we will take always a conservative approach with revenues, but especially in areas where there's that vulnerability that we don't want to go so high, so aggressive that the bottom drops out and then, you know, we've got a problem in the budget. Basic education is the darker blue line, and special education is the lighter blue line. We'll talk a little bit more about the special education subsidy later in the presentation as it compares to special education expense. But suffice it to say, I would just say basic education subsidy, you can see the growth there through 23, 24. I think from my perspective, as much as I have appreciated, you see a little bit steeper line there in the last 2 or 3 years. I've appreciated those significant investments in education, but I also think when you look at just raw dollars, that alone doesn't maybe tell the whole picture because we've also grown pretty significantly in enrollment. And so if you look at basic education funding as a function of individual enrollment per pupil, and then look at what the percentage growth is during the same period of time, I think it probably does look a little different compared to some other school districts in the area. I know that the basic education funding formula was meant to try to help equalize that, but then you have hold harmless, and now you've got the Ready to Learn block grant, and so we're creating all kinds of different funding mechanisms for schools at the state level, ultimately aimed to try to address inequity. But I also think there's still some blind spots in terms of schools that have quickly growing enrollments, or they have other pressures in their budget that they're trying to react to at a local level.
I think you bring up an important point about, as we look at so far in 24, 25, it's safe to say that we're seeing that line continue to spike upwards. However, that spike has more to do, or as much to do with the block grant, which is not hold harmless, as it does the true increase in the subsidy overall. So again, that's something we'll have to navigate at budget time of how much of that do we account for and how much.
Yep. And I think Dr. Bitz raises a good point. The block grant, they kind of really adjusted what that looks like, and there's questions about that, and then what's that look like in 25, 26. So all of those things are things that we'll track as we head into the March timeframe here.
It's going in the right direction.
Yes, going up. Revenue is the one that we want to see those ones with a positive direction upward. Now, expense, that's a good preview that we have some expenses that are going up too, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. I always like to, at least for a frame of reference, kind of think about our expense side of the budget in terms of buckets. And so when you think about the most significant buckets, wages and benefits are almost 70% of our budget. Purchase services are 16%, supplies and equipment are 6%, and other in financing at 9% really represents our debt service. And so you like to see that at about 10% or less, give or take around 10% or less. That's a good benchmark in terms of the mortgage payment. The purchase services at 16%, I'll say that one is, all of the other slices of the pie are very like and similar, everything contained in those buckets. Purchase services does have a variety of things because of the way we code our expenses. That 16% looks like a big slice of the pie, but it includes everything from transportation of students to contracted services with student services and special ed. It includes our charter school tuition. And so it looks like a big slice of the pie. There's a lot of mandated costs in there, or costs that we manage as best we can, but also costs that will ultimately influence the budget one way or the other. In terms of medical expense, so I think what I wanted to make the point here, a couple points, I guess. Maybe I'll draw your attention first to the left-hand side, that little box that shows the 3, 5, 7, and 10-year average. And so for a long time at Mechanicsburg, we saw those 3, 5, 7, and 10-year averages at around 8% at all of those intervals. And so usually when we look back 3 years, it was about 8% per year. Usually when we look back 5 years, it was about 8% per year, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, what has happened in the last 3 years is that we've seen a more significant, more dramatic increase in costs, and we'll talk a little bit on the next slide about some of the why behind that. Mr. Bradley pointed out in another conversation, and I thought it was a good preview, that other organizations are also experiencing some higher claims. Suffice it to say, you can see the 3-year average is at 16%, but I would call out within that 3-year average, 21, 22, and 23, 24. You can see both of those as far as how quickly they increased. Both of those increases in each of those years was north of 20% in terms of cost. Health insurance is one of our biggest line items. It's about $10 million. And so when you talk about a 20% increase on $10 million, it's a $2 million increase in terms of total cost. And so that line of best fit, probably as you go back in the older years, it was more true to, maybe you had some ups and downs, but generally speaking, it averaged out to 8% over the long run. Where over the last 3 years, that has not been the case, and we know that's going to create some pressure in our budget process and something that we're going to continue to monitor.
Again, just in terms of this year, so far, we're trending in that 20% neighborhood as opposed to one of those for this year.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good. That's an excellent point. Is that as much as we would have hoped, you can see 21, 22 to 22, 23, it kind of leveled off. We track our healthcare weekly, actually, instead of monthly. And to Dr. Bitz's point, it is more like the trends we were seeing in 21, 22, and 23, 24 than the trends we saw, coming off a big increase in 22, 23.
How's that compared to the nation? Have you looked at that? Any comparative?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
I haven't seen any data lately. I won't own it. That's why.
So we talked to Conrad Siegel, who's our healthcare consultant, and they've said the national trend generally is in that like 7-8% on average. I think the 16%. There's a few things on the next slide that we'll get into, but generally I think their recommendation is to stay the course with like that 8, 7, 8, maybe 9 because of some of what we're seeing. But I think we have to continue to monitor that because I'm not sure 9, for instance, is going to be enough if we know we're coming off a big increase in 23, 24, and back to Dr. Bitz's point, we're seeing it at 20 or more again in 24, 25, we're going to have to probably react more significantly for 25, 26.
So it appears we're ahead of the nation right now.
At least in the last
over the past
3 years or so, yeah, we're trending higher.
The nationwide average, I guess.
Yeah. So I would say, and I think, Mr. Rupp's point was a good one. There's kind of what happens in national stage, and I think those are good to track what's happening, what's the average increases look like, what are trends happening at a national level, but then also what are some specific inflators for what we're seeing. And so I think at a national level, there's kind of the post-COVID, there was a little bit of a rebound. So during COVID and the pandemic, some people delayed medical services or they put them off, and so you had a year or two following COVID where people then started to probably come out at a higher frequency to get caught back up on whatever it was they were pushing off. Rising pharmacy costs, and this is a national trend, but we'll actually talk about it down below, specific to us, is certainly an element, but maybe even more specifically specialty drugs and the cost of those. Increasing demand for mental health services, new treatments and technologies, healthcare staffing shortages, provider consolidation. So that's kind of the national stage, and I think Mr. Rupp's point was a good one. At a national level, they're seeing 8% around, that increasing annually. But for us, we've outpaced that, and part of the reason we've outpaced that is when you look at our healthcare trends, we have seen some pretty significant increases in, for instance, GLP-1 prescriptions. So if you're watching TV on the weekends and you're seeing I think it's Ozempic commercials, it's a very expensive drug. Not to say that, well, there's a lot you can say about that. But Ozempic can be used for diabetes, but it can also be used for weight loss. And so you have an expensive drug, and the frequency with which it's being prescribed has increased, and so we've seen that in our plan utilization. High cost scripts. So this is an interesting statistic from Conrad Siegel. The top 20 drugs account for over 60% of prescription spend, which includes GLP-1 drugs. And so really, I think what that's saying is there's a frequency element to it, but there's also the nature of specialty drugs and how expensive they can be versus certain other medicines, you get from the doctor, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, but like a common prednisone or steroid or something probably is far cheaper than some of these specialty drugs that might get prescribed. The other thing is high claimants, and so Conrad Siegel tracks on our behalf, and we talk with Conrad Siegel about all of these trends. Dr. Bitz and I, Mrs. Ely, we will have periodic meetings with Conrad Siegel throughout the year, at least once or twice a year, although Mrs. Ely meets with them more frequently. But the three of us talk about what are they seeing in our claims cost, like what's driving claims, and in some of our recent meetings, these conversations have come out. And so high dollar claimants above 150,000, they start tracking them for a couple reasons, just to see what's going on in our plan. But also they track them so that we have stop loss insurance. We are self-insured, but we do have stop loss insurance because theoretically you could have something catastrophic happen. And so say I had something catastrophic happen to me and you had $1 million claim, that would be very costly. And so we have stop loss insurance at an individual level that it's probably around $350,000. We would pay the first $350,000, and then everything above it gets picked up by stop loss insurance. And so it helps you. You can be self-insured. You can take advantage of being self-insured because we're big enough, and there is savings there. But then you're also not exposing yourself to like infinite risk because of maybe something catastrophic that happens within your plan. But having said that, the high dollar claimants are tracked because we do get stop loss insurance above a certain attachment point. But you can see there, the ones we've been tracking over the years are at 150,000 or above. And those are 7, 4, and then you can see back 3, 2. If you go back further, it probably was more like 2, 3, in those years even that aren't listed. And so in the last 2 or 3 years, we've definitely had higher frequency of those high dollar claimants. I do want to just also mention in tracking them, all of it's anonymous. Conrad Siegel, it's not about the people or names or anything like that. It's just more about the data to say what is the data aggregated saying to us about our claims cost and how does that translate to the budget. So,
can I ask? I get what you're saying about it being anonymous. I'm trying to not want to ask in a hypothetical way. We picked up are our benefits more advantageous for someone who might be more tenured or more older might be more prone to being in this category than if, they moved from the Erie School District to us. Is that a driver? I get that because we're in the South Central Trust, I assume we're pretty close to the other participants in there, even if their plans are slightly different. But do you believe that, that's also a reason it could be fine to have, we want to have good benefits, but is there is that something also that, or, I don't know. I don't even know if you could figure that out.
Yeah, no, I
Matters.
think I know where you're heading with it. I think a couple pieces, I think within kind of the education world in general, a lot of school districts have pretty similar plan designs, and it gets a little, let me say this, pretty similar plans in terms of like the level of benefits offered. The reason I say it that way is some schools have a PPO, they have a small deductible, but maybe they have a really high premium share, 15 or 20% or something. Versus like maybe there's a smaller premium share, but they have a $2,000, $4,000 deductible. And so I think really all of those dials point back to what degree does the employee pay versus to what degree does the employer pay. And kind of that richness of the benefit, I think, is always the push and pull of where you are with it. Schools often are probably more closely aligned in that way. That's not to say you can't ever look at this and say, what can we do differently about medical costs? But I think to your question about maybe people moving from district to district, I don't know if that would be driving decisions as much as maybe someone who comes to the school district world from another industry because they want that richer benefit plan. So sometimes you might have a spouse who maybe came to the school district because they wanted better medical benefits for their family. Versus like someone hopping amongst districts.
Yeah, you wouldn't move districts for a knee replacement.
Probably.
But you might move to get better benefits in a public setting from your current employer. Okay.
Just to add a little bit of information on the GLP-1 prescription. So GLP-1 is a category of prescriptions. It's a category of drugs. And there's a number of different drugs that fall under that particular category of GLP-1. There are some of those that are specifically prescribed for people with diabetes. There are several of them that are specifically prescribed for people that are simply looking for weight loss purposes, unrelated to diabetes. A number of years ago, the information Conrad Siegel had shared with us in 2021, at that point, we had a number of prescriptions or a number of expense related to GLP-1 drugs specific to diabetes, but at that time we had no dollars spent for any of the weight loss GLP-1 drugs. In 21-22, the first one, Wegovy, we started having an expense related there, and then in the years since, that has become a greater and greater share to the point where now it's 89% is actually a weight loss indication as opposed to 46% of diabetes. Diabetes is actually, I believe by law or by regulation, required to be something at this point that you would provide prescription benefits towards. The weight loss is one that I don't believe is protected by law. But
right.
No,
And I think
but like, the people in the plans, their plan is not paying for those, is it?
Kurt?
Yeah.
100%? Like,
I mean, they would have their same like deductible and
So
the prescriptions would be processed one similar to each other, I'll say. And so if you have
somebody taking it for weight loss versus somebody taking it for diabetes,
Yeah.
Or employed,
Right.
their co-pay on it would be the same roughly.
Copay or they could
Or
have
however-
deductible, depending on which of the plans they're in, but yes.
because that's not normal, I don't think.
And
This
I-
last year was just under 75,000 that we paid for the weight loss indication. It was 173,000 for the diabetes indication.
And I think to Dr. Bitz's point, it's a good one, just the trends that we track through the plan over the years is a number of years ago for the weight loss Ozempic, that would have probably been 0. And I can't remember the year off the top of my head, but I think if you go back far enough, it hadn't been really something that was even on the list at that point.
This is a new thing in the last couple of years, but
So enlighten me, who puts this on the list then? I mean, is this, I mean, I understand some of it is through a association, some of it's contractual, some of it's not, but who decides what's gonna be on that list? Like,
So there's probably a variety of ways that could be influenced. I would say Capital or Highmark or whoever your carrier is helps to manage kind of the framework of all of that. I think it's kind of it's such a complex piece there because you also have pharmaceutical companies who they want to move from generic to specialty, and so there are even instances where, you know, if drug A and drug B can be prescribed to a patient, both of them are generic. A prescription company, as I understand it, could combine A and B into C, and now C is a different formulary, it could be charged at a higher rate. And so C costs more money, but A and B are cheaper, and really in terms of the efficacy of it, A and B would do the same thing as C. But so there's lots of little pieces to the pharmaceutical world and how that impacts healthcare costs, and I think as we continue to monitor healthcare, there's a variety of trends that we continue to monitor, and especially drugs are among them.
And Capital would, in your example, would put it on the list to help defer other costs later. Like you could lose 100 pounds, you would, be much lower risk for a bunch of other things later down the road. So it's not like, and even here, like even though we have an increase in this cost, it's possible that we, avoided 4 knee replacements, 10 years from now that don't need to happen. I don't know.
and I would say I would find it very hard to find somebody that right now their insurance company would pay for it. So I'm surprised that we're getting away, we're having that much being paid for through the district. Because I don't know anybody else that really gets it paid for.
But you're saying it's paid like any other prescription gets paid for. Right?
Currently,
unless you are diabetic and like covered.
because we really don't go through, like we don't sit down annually with Capital and say, here's the list of 1,000 medicines and what is covered or what isn't covered. They help manage all of that for us. Now, there are, like, I think just for full transparency, I think organizations, and I think you alluded probably maybe more than some of the private sector, they can manage how the plan is structured and what types of things are paid for or aren't paid for, or do they have a higher, is it a higher deductible specific to certain things, or do you have like a narrow network? There's so many different combinations in like the healthcare world of how to manage costs. I think that probably a lot of it comes back to just that. How do you manage costs? Like what's the employer share versus what's the employee share? How some of it's also recognizing some of these things are also collectively bargained. And so the conversation with MEA or our Act 93 team or what do we want to do for support staff. And so I think it's just I'll say the expense has increased. So it's our largest line item. Well, it's one of our largest line items. And the expense has increased in a way that it just is a signal for us to continue to study very closely what's happening with healthcare.
I think you answered my question there is we, first, the Mechanicsburg School District, we allow Capital to make that decision for the most part.
Stuff, yeah.
We're not in-house analyzing every pharmaceutical that's available and what we're covering and what we're not. We contract to them and they, through the medical process, determine what.
Yeah, this was highlighted more as when Conrad Siegel sits down with us for our regular meetings. These are the highlights that they pointed out to us and what has driven those 20% increases in these factors for us.
And when you talk, Mr. Long, about the stop loss and how much times we're now reaching that floor, let's see like how you want to look at it. Have we adjusted that for medical inflation also, or have we used that same number?
We look at the attachment point for the stop loss annually with our healthcare consultant. I would say the answer probably varies from school district to school district or organization to organization, because some of it is like how big of an organization are you? How many employees do you have? Where you could absorb probably more risk versus like in the prior district, we were probably a quarter of the size of Mechanicsburg, and so our attachment point was lower because there's more risk there, and so It varies. We do look at it annually, and it's probably a little bit of like cost benefit, almost like even like your car insurance or house insurance. Like what level of coverage do you want? But know that the cost is going to be commensurate probably with however you adjust that. And so we try to strike that just right balance.
And that's something we look at.
We do.
Through your office.
Yes, yeah.
Every year when we contract.
Yep.
Thank
So this slide, I think, dental and vision most certainly is not a huge part of the budget, I would say, but I think you can see the cost here in terms of family benefits, and I think I just wanted to share or point out, just like we were talking about specialty drugs and how Capital helps maintain, that listing, Capital, Delta Dental, they also maintain who the providers are in network, out of network, and those things. And we've been kind of monitoring some situations around dental and vision, and you can see the costs as flat as they are. I think you could say part of that's how they're managing their network with their providers. And so we plan to return to the board in another conversation at some point about some continued discussions around insurance, medical, dental, vision, but really the trends we wanted to talk about with medical, dental, vision was where are we currently, and then as we continue here in the months, we want to have some more discussion. So.
Right, I didn't understand that graph. Is that like we pay 10 grand in dental every year? It costs, it seems.
Yeah, the chart, the 10,000s, that always confuses me too. I think it's more like 1,000 is the chart for family benefits. Because our annual cost of dental is more like 400,000, and that has been the same 400,000 year over year for a number of years. This was more representative of the cost of family coverage for dental and the cost of family coverage for vision. If you look at the very bottom there.
But that doesn't make sense either, right? The dental costs aren't 10 grand for family. Like.
Yeah, I think that's probably mislabeled.
Okay, I got you. All right.
Yeah. That's
carry on, please.
Just the cost per employee. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Sorry about that. PSERS. So with our trends, we always look back with the board, generally around 10-year marks. I think this one I would just share very quickly. Back in 2009, 10, 11, our annual PSERS expense was more like $1.2 million, $1.3 million. You can see how it arced up to 2014, 15, and then it continued arcing up to now north of 12 million. The percentages that are listed there on the line show the percentage of covered payroll that we contribute to PSERS. And so as the board recalls, the reason it's kind of a steady increase like that year over year was they put collars and caps in place, which actually contributed a little bit to the growing liability through those years because we didn't go right to whatever percentage the actuary said. Rather, the state kind of said, we'll increase pension expense by 3 or 4 or 5% per year in a graduated way, and probably was good for all the organizations and school districts and PSERS because, frankly, if in 2010-11 they just jumped right to where it was supposed to be, that would have had some pretty crippling effects. I think the reality is, though, where is the pension funding status? So you can see it's kind of in that 34, 35% it's settled in. First time you can see a little bit of a decrease here at 34%. The other point I wanted to make was at just over 12 million, the orange bar is the revenue, and so when you see the revenue increase for PSERS, that's nice to see revenue increase. I think we all like that, but the reality is it's representative of 2 times that increase of expense on the other side of the budget. And so it's something that we monitor as part of the budget process.
But here's the history. Let's go back a second. So 2009, I think a number of us were sitting in this boardroom and over several meetings, and we saw those charts where it was jumping up into the 30s, and Dr. Van Drew was talking about how are we going to do this, and we set aside fund balance to be able to gradually increase those percentages. And the question everybody asked was, is it just going to keep going up forever, or will it ever come back down? Well, 15 years later, we can answer the question. It will come back down, because this is the first time it's gone back down since 2009. So
at least for 1 year.
Come back down. So.
I'm actually glad that I almost forgot to mention. I'm glad Dr. Bitts mentioned that because as we were setting aside fund balance, we do have some committed fund balance in the general fund for PSERS, and as the board knows, we've been stepping that down because we've gotten to the point where largely we've gotten fees are to a pretty good place in the budget, and so we're going to continue to step that out of the budget, just because the committed fund balances we view as the more significant vulnerabilities in the budget, like healthcare and those sorts of things, and so we continue to make some recommended adjustments there.
Mr. Long, when they redid it a couple of years back, it's still another 10, 15, or maybe even 20 years before the number really starts to come down
Yes, I think you're
to a
right.
significant amount.
And some of that was the unfunded liability as it was in 2010-11, and then because we didn't, and I think I want to be careful because the graduated response was the right thing to do for school districts, but because we kept underfunding the way the plan was until we got probably to about 18, 19, 19, 20, it added probably to the liability in the long run, and it's going to stay in those 30s for quite a while now. But
we've also had really poor returns and really great years. They missed the opportunity to help the long term.
And us.
Just in the interest of time, I'll just step through these last two a little more quickly here. I know we have a few other presentations on the docket. Special education expense and subsidies. So this is maybe a chart that helps kind of reconcile or at least just depict special ed cost is in the blue and special ed subsidies in the orange. And I think what this is telling us, the story it's telling us is we desire and want to continue to provide high level of education for all of our students. Those costs are increasing, but the state's commitment to help support those costs, they're not keeping up with the proportional increases we're seeing in the cost to provide education. You can see sharper line up, and then you can see just about how that's been, in fairness, they've been increasing special ed subsidy, but certainly not commensurate with the costs that we have been seeing increasing. So. PA Cyber Charter School. So this is another one where I think there is some legislative impact. You know, the last one obviously was how much the special ed revenue do we receive on a year-to-year basis. This one is around charter schools and the costs. The orange line is our annual tuition expense, and so you can see this last year we were probably closer to $4.5 million. The two dotted lines are our enrollment at the charter schools. So orange is our regular ed students and blue is our special ed students. And so if you were to add those two together, that would give you the enrollment. So for instance, 2014-15, 107 plus 23 is 130. And so in 2014-15, we had about 130 students. And then you can see kind of how that has progressed over the years. I know enrollment has increased. This is something we're studying administratively to say, where are we with charter schools? Where are we with our program? I think we've certainly studied that over the years, and I would share there's a couple things happening probably with charter school enrollment. One is there's a high transiency, and so you do get students that never step foot in Mechanicsburg that transfer into the district or move into the district, and they're already out in charter school, and so that's an element of sometimes what we see. There's certainly choice, you know, in students choosing and families choosing to go out to charter school, but then there's also the total enrollment has increased, and so that's that kind of maroon box in the bottom corner. If you look at 2014-15, the 130 students represented 3% of our total enrollment, and 23-24 they represented 5% of our total enrollment. So certainly we've increased. I mean, obviously you can see the increase, but also I think if you would expect that 3% to hold steady from our enrollment in 2014-15 all the way up to 23-24, we probably would have seen an increase anyway in enrollment, all else being equal. Now, having said that, we know we want to continue to look into charter school and enrollment, and we intend to continue to do so. But this is where we're at with cost and trend. Any questions? I just want to say and acknowledge Mrs. Ely. She's not here this evening. She was an integral part in helping put the presentation together and has continued to do a tremendous job. Met with Dr. Pitstein on several occasions as we prepared for tonight, and we continue to press forward in the budget process. So.
Thank you for an easy to understand and fine report. That will move to item 3.02, fund balance commitments, general fund. Mr. Lombo.
All right. I will try to keep this one shorter than the last one. With one page, I think we can do it. So we talked about kind of working in 3 years. This is that first of the 3 years, 23-24. So we wrapped up our 23-24 school year on June 30th. And then through the fall, we continued to work on the audit, finalizing numbers, and just getting a good view of where were we with total revenues, where were we with total expenses, what's happening with our fund balance. And so pleased to report to the board that in terms of total revenue, total expense in the general fund, we did just a little bit better than break even with a $99,000 surplus in the general fund. Our fund balance will be reported in total at about $19.6 million in the general fund. And then the recommendations below are the commitments for the individual categories of fund balance that we would like to recommend to the school board. And so really, fund balance commitments is a two-part process. If you recall back in the spring, we talked about the categories of expense that we would like to set aside in fund balance. And then coming back now that the audit's done, we're assigning what those numbers are to those commitments. The other thing I always like to share about fund balance commitments is, to me, these are representative of areas of potential vulnerability. And so you want to avoid situations where, like medical, we've got some pretty significant increases happening. And so if we ever had a deficit, say that $99,000 is all of a sudden a deficit, we've set money aside because we know medical is a vulnerability in the budget and can be a vulnerability in the budget. And then we've got money set aside in these different categories to help kind of buffer that, offset it, knowing that we will ultimately have to address it, but it gives us some options to address it. We've got money set aside, and then in future budgets, we would continue to make adjustments.
Questions for Mr. Longwell? All right, thank you. Move on to item 4, curriculum 4.01, elementary fine and applied arts. Dr.
All right, let's get into some academic program discussion. Love the business talk too, but some fun conversations to have here. So I gave a little bit of a teaser to this in our last board presentation when we had Rachel Connell, one of our art teachers, share. And art is just one piece of the fine and applied arts program that we provide to our elementary students. We have long had a history of a pretty robust fine and applied arts program at the elementary level, but we haven't changed it in quite some time from a program evaluation perspective, let's say. There have been little Band-Aids that we've applied along the way as we needed to make shifts due to staffing or any number of different reasons. For example, at one point we shifted a health class and instead we brought in keyboarding. For a long time we've had 2 musics in certain years and then just 1 in other years. There's long been a tradition of kindergarten being a grade since we moved to the kindergarten academy, that there were no guaranteed fine and applied arts, but if we had any left over, if you will, that we would be able to send some services this way in certain years. So some years there were music classes downstairs, other years there were not. Some years there were art, other years there were not, PE and so on. So all that to say, it's been a while since we really dug into why do we provide the fine and applied arts programs that we have, and are there some new programs that we should use to revitalize what we offer, as well as other districts have infused some other different classes within the elementary program. So with that, we had a group, well, 2 folks that really led the charge, Mrs. Woodall and Mr. Underkoffler, and then they brought a committee of folks together, and I won't steal any more of their thunder. I'll let them talk about the process and kind of where we stand with things from here.
So thank you all for having us here this evening. If you remember way back in September, Mrs. Bachman and I were up here and we discussed some of the goals for the academic program this year, and one of the goals was to reimagine our elementary fine and applied arts for the very reasons why Dr. Bitts just stated. This process actually started last year. In fact, I believe I was on the job for a whopping 2 weeks when we were at our elementary principals meeting, and many of the questions that Dr. Bitts was just discussing came up, and we were like, we should do an elementary fine and applied arts program evaluation. So this process started last year. What we're going to do today is we're just going to walk you through the process that we went through last year bleeding into this year with some preliminary recommendations coming from the committee that we formed the last year. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Mr. Underkoffler here.
Can I wreck your whole presentation right now?
Of
By the way,
course.
all these questions came from Dr. Lebo
Okay.
tonight. Everything. Your preamble there made me think that we haven't been organized with this program, and I remember Mr. K coming in with 20, versions of the whole, music program from K to 12, I thought, or the transfer goals and all that, right? And so how are we, why are we doing, I see it says why here, but like why did we do what we did before, and does it sound like we're starting from scratch now?
So I'll separate the conversation from individual departments who are doing curriculum work versus a program from the perspective of all of these different content areas. So music, PE, each of them have gone through, created their curriculum K through 12, but they have done that, frankly, without a guaranteed kindergarten class in place. PE, similarly, they've created and articulated their program K through 12, again, without knowing that one year or another. So we've done that for music, we've done that for PE. Art was the most recent one that we did. Library is still in the working stages of theirs. So we've done those programmatically, but when you look at the elementary experience itself, that's where some of these little shifts have happened over time of what do we offer, how many times, in which years, again, what do we offer downstairs, and they'll talk about a couple of the other little intricacies.
Okay, thanks. Trying to fit the puzzle pieces together.
So as Dr. Bitt said, I'm somewhat new to the elementary principal team, so this is my 5th year as head principal at Elmwood, as 2 years as assistant principal there before. But as long as I can remember being around the table, having this push and pull around, are we really offering the best programming for our students? And really, it had nothing to do with believing we should abolish art or music or any of the programs. It really came down to 3rd grade keyboarding. And as Dr. Bitts often will, see some, the rest of us see a challenge, and he sees an opportunity, right? It's dress code, I see an opportunity there, right? It's a structural calendar, there's an opportunity. So, and so we really had an opportunity to take a look at a bunch of things. Well, why not, as we're looking under the hood, let's check the whole engine here. So to be able to make sure that what we're offering aligns best with our vision, it's future focused, no matter, as a changing workforce is upon us, are we really equipping our students of these skills? And again, credit to the board going through the PSERS challenge, and when other schools are facing furloughs and not knowing what to do with the budget crisis, it was a commitment for the board to be able to say, no, the arts program is very important to us here. And so we still say it's still important to us. Yet how do we seize this opportunity here to make sure we're offering the best for us, for our students? So a little bit of what the guaranteed, and focus on the guaranteed, because as the conversation alluded to, even though right now it says 0 in kindergarten, that doesn't mean that there aren't kindergarten opportunities right now. It just means that there's nothing guaranteed. So they truly are getting the leftovers, whatever is available still for the remaining fine and applied arts teachers that we have after we've been able to direct their schedules to take over the 1st to 5th grade offerings that we have. So let me interpret this a little bit more because these 30s, 60s, 180s may not mean much to you right now. So we operate on a 6-day cycle, And so if the course offerings happens once per 6-day cycle, that'll equate up to 30 times a year. So these are yearly offerings. Out of the 180 days, 30 means that, so art in first grade meets once a cycle, and art all the way through 5th grade meets once a cycle. This is the guaranteed experience that our students have right now.
I do want to talk a little bit about that. As you guys had at the last board meeting, kindergarten art is happening right now, but again, as Mr. Underkoffler said, it's sort of a hodgepodge of leftovers. So we have a fine and applied arts matrix where it's like a Sudoku puzzle to figure out which teachers go to which building at which time, and whenever that's figured out for 1st through 5th grade, whatever spaces there are left over, they can go to kindergarten. So it literally is sort of like how well does the Sudoku puzzle match together as to what does kindergarten get at that moment in time. So when we were doing this program evaluation, we had 4 guiding questions that we were looking at. So when we were going through, we said, how can our elementary fine and applied arts program help us to reach our vision and mission? And how is it already doing so? How are we meeting PDE's requirements for Chapter 4? And how are we leveraging our human resources that we currently have? How are we, with our elementary fine and applied arts, aligned to the developmental stages of our learners? So we were using some chipped wood in there and yardsticks to look at what's developmentally appropriate for each grade level of students. And then what are other school districts doing, and how does that reach into our other 3 guiding questions? What are other places offering, and how does that align to our vision and mission? How does that meet PDE's Chapter 4 requirements? How does that meet the developmental readiness of our students? So those were the guiding questions that we looked through when we formed our overall committee. So Ms. Underkoffler, we started our committee last year right around December. So we had an elementary fine and applied arts committee that was composed of some district office representatives. So the assistant to the superintendent, Dr. Bitz at the time, was part of our fine and applied arts committee. Our supervisor of elementary curriculum assessment and instruction, so Mrs. Linda Bachman, myself. We had our director of human resources, Christine Stata, and then we also wanted the lens from special education services and how are we best servicing our special education students at that K-5 fine and applied arts level as well. Then we had some principal representation, so people in the building level, so the kindergarten principal at the time. We had a 1-3 principal representation, and Mr. Underkoffler was our 4-5 representation. And then we also had our K-12 department coordinators who run the fine and applied arts programs at that K-12 level, so art, health and PE, music, and library. So we had that big conglomerate of different perspectives for when we did this program evaluation. From there, we decided to split up into several subcommittees to investigate our fine and applied arts questions, the guiding questions that we had. So I ran the curriculum subcommittee, and part of our curriculum subcommittee was to go through and really investigate what our current offerings were for our fine and applied arts, how that curriculum helps us meet our vision and mission. So what are our strengths there? And I have to say, like, even with Band-Aids, as Dr. Bitz was saying, our elementary fine and applied arts program is stellar. Our teachers are amazing. The curriculum has really done a nice job at meeting PDE's requirements and developmentally appropriate. With that, we also did find some recommendations for us moving forward that we took later to the committee as a whole. So
I led 2 committees, one of which was examining our human resource side of it. There's a reason why we spend 70% of our budget on human resources here. And so how do we leverage our people? What are the parameters around the CBA? Are there things that we need to keep in mind as far as certifications go and job descriptions? And so with Mrs. Stata, Dr. Rudisil, we dug into these things here to also provide recommendations back to the larger whole. The other committee I led, subcommittee I led, was learning from others. So we reached out and interviewed representatives from Big Spring, Carlisle, Cumberland Valley, Northern, Hershey, to be able to see what are they offering. We even went on a field trip to Cumberland Valley to Monroe Elementary to take a look at their exploration program. We tapped into Kristen Sachs at the time, who came from Hershey. We tapped into Dave Eckelmeyer, who came from Northern and also taught at Cumberland Valley. So we try to really tap into our connections to those around us to consider what else should we be offering. What are some lessons that we can learn from them too?
Last January, February, all three subcommittees reconvened to give the recommendations that we investigated as our small groups. And without the conversations of what each subcommittee was investigating, we found these 4 themes coming from each of the subcommittees. So this is the committee of the whole recommendations moving forward from that Fine and Applied Arts program evaluation. The first recommendation was to guarantee a Fine and Applied Arts rotation at the Kindergarten Academy. So again, it's very difficult with, sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't, to have that continuous K-12 programming, especially when you think about first grade. Sometimes those kids come in with background knowledge and sometimes they don't. It really just depends on what the Sudoku matrix looked like the previous year. It was also a recommendation to remove keyboarding at the 3rd grade level. When we look at our mission and vision, does keyboarding help with that? Yes, but we also, as a committee of the whole, thought of something better to help us really meet our vision and mission, which is to add STEM to that Fine and Applied Arts rotation. And then if you look at that 4th bullet, continue school counseling lessons outside of the Fine and Applied Arts rotation. As part of the journey to other schools, some school districts do offer counseling as a Fine and Applied Arts. I actually came from one in Shippensburg. Counseling was part of our Fine and Applied Arts program. And what we had discussed as that committee is the role of the counselor, if they are utilized in the classroom instructing, that takes them away from providing some of those tier 2 and tier 3 supports for those students. So it's not that they're not instructing, they still do provide lessons in the classroom, but keeping them out of that every 6-day cycle, the committee thought was important moving forward. So those are the 4 main recommendations of the committee. What we've been doing now is we've been trying to see what do those 4 recommendations really look like as a plan when we create a matrix for days of the cycle. So you can see the addition of STEM into the FAA rotation. Generalized math means adding something, means that you have to reorganize, reallocate, and take away from some areas as well. So we've been working on that, taking some information to Cabinet, to the Instructional Coordinating Council, getting some feedback from them, going back to the drawing board. In January, we'll be coming forth with some more recommendations that better refine these generalized recommendations. So with that.
Yeah, the final point I'll make is all 3 subcommittees met separately. Like only Sherry and I were, in the background and but our goal wasn't to coerce the subcommittees to secretly do what we hoped that they would land on anyway. Like it was truly miraculous that this was a consensus from all 3. So there were other recommendations beyond this, but really this was a consensus that was reached.
Share with you a little bit of the end game here as we look ahead to a January presentation and then kind of beyond. There are some aspects, even with these recommendations, that don't really require board approval per se, but there are implications for the recommendations and ultimate plan that absolutely will require board approval, not necessarily even just for next year, but over the next couple of years as the team looks at what does a stepped implementation plan look like over a couple of years' time. So obviously that could mean, perhaps adding a staff member in a particular area one year and then adding another in another year. It could mean some curricular updates that again would come to the board. So ultimately what we're going to be looking to do is after the final recommendations are pulled together, which we're close now, but pulling those together and presenting those in January and looking ultimately for the board to endorse the plan. That way at least we have the knowledge that the board is supporting the overall plan that we have, and that way we can begin to move forward with that implementation plan knowing that that could mean some specific board approvals that you would then have the option to approve or disapprove along the way in that first year, and maybe some more in the second year. But at least we would know moving forward that we should continue that process with your support. If that makes sense. If you have questions about that, I know it's a little different than some things we do, but we want to make sure we have the board's endorsement.
Is it, so based on those recommendations, I don't see any kind of elimination of the current programming other than keyboard?
There is no, I can say with confidence that there is no desire to eliminate any of the big four that we have. We are still going to have students at every grade level receiving art, music, health and PE, and library. That those are going to continue to be staples of what our students receive.
And with STEM, is that something, maybe you don't know this yet, is that something that's a one-year thing, or is that something that has a progression across, is that an additional, a special, we'll call it, or program?
I'll answer a little bit and then I'll let them chime in. I think one of the things we've seen with keyboarding is that the 1 year, one time a cycle just doesn't have much of an impact. So how do we have something that really can develop, and ultimately with the STEEL standards as well, really becomes something that we have to infuse within the elementary program in certain ways. So that will give us the opportunity to build some of those skills to the guaranteed viable program in the STEEL's area in tech ed at the middle school level and then at the high school level. I'll let them chime in with anything.
Yeah, so as Dr. Biggs was saying, one time, one grade, just really, I mean, we've seen it with keyboarding. It's, kids are still, they're surviving though with their typing skills. They type better than I do with 5 years of actual keyboarding instruction with their thumbs and peck. But so we are looking to build more of a continuous aspect to it, looking specifically at those technology and engineering portion of the STEEL standards. Science and environmental literacy is going to be picked up by the core curriculum, but where is that technology education going to live? You know,
Library?
realistically, it's going to sort of look at that integration of STEM.
Our next presentation.
That's where you're kind of doing it, but they did a good job at it too.
Yeah, wasn't that
They did a
we had coding, right? And that was part of the
It's
library.
safe to say that library has begun to infuse some of it. They certainly have other traditional library aspects as well, particularly in the primary level. So there is a marriage there that we're pretty excited is something you're going to see in the next presentation.
So do you see you changing the number of times that one of these happen during a cycle?
Yes.
It's going to happen that way to really beef up that STEM addition to there, is changing how often certain things meet when.
Yeah, like there's 5 now. Do you come up with a 6th one so you have one?
You guys are getting into the January presentation, so.
Hold that for a couple of months.
Okay, well,
I think the benefit overall, while I wouldn't suggest that a fine and applied art in kindergarten is equivalent to something offered in 4th and 5th grade, by adding a guaranteed program at kindergarten, that's adding sections over the course of the K through 5 program for students in a way that you wouldn't necessarily see a number reduction over the course of the 6 years.
I just can't help, I know about the planning period aspect of things.
For kindergarten.
Yeah, so
Yes.
that'll just come into play here somewhere.
That has been
That's
part of
the
it. We
recommendation.
actually
Oh, okay, I
feel,
can't wait. I'm ready. I can't wait to hear it.
we feel pretty comfortable that we've got some good plans in place for that too.
Is there a right number? You put up a bunch of numbers at the beginning, 30 days of this in a year. Is there like a better, like, whether it's the other 5 districts you surveyed, or like something in chapter 4 or whatever that's like you should have twice this much in art as you have, or anything?
So the mandate in chapter 4 is physical education is the mandate in chapter 4. However, you do have standards as well for all of those areas. We also have standards for foreign language at the elementary level and family consumer science at the elementary level. And so there are chapter 4 standards requirements that, I mean, I don't know any local district that offers family consumer science in the elementary level, nor world languages at the elementary level. But it's sort of, I mean, a mixed bag as to what is offered everywhere. I mean,
Elementary Spanish was an offering when I first started teaching 20 years ago here. So it becomes a game of priorities. So what do we feel is best? I still think that when we're talking about no matter what it is up there, to me it all still boils down to this is another opportunity outside the core curriculum to focus on those 4 C's. So collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, communication. So that's why I would say no matter what it is, like that's still why they're still so important no matter what we're offering.
Yeah, I mean, some of our neighboring districts offer PE/health once per cycle. Some of our neighboring districts offer art one year and not another. So there's not really a best recommendation coming from the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And then when you look at this smattering of districts around, it's what best fits the needs of that district and what best meets the mission and vision. So as we went through this evaluation, the only thing that we could recommend eliminating was keyboarding, because everything else up there really speaks to our mission and vision, and it really does help our students become more well-rounded learners, ready to be prepared in a diverse society. So, we really thought it was important that we keep everything except for keyboarding, so.
I think just one more piece on that. I think that was the importance of having those department coordinators at the table with us. That this is their baby, this is their content areas, and they know it best. So for them to be able to advocate and talk about where are their content areas best placed, if there is a doubling up of something, where is that best placed in the progression of somebody's developmental stages. So being able to have them at the table, and credit to them, they did an awesome job through the conversation and getting to the point where ultimately they said, I think we've shared all we can share. We're not going to, none of us are going to sit here and say, please take some away from us. So I think we've done all the advocating we can, and now we trust that some of us may end up being disappointed in some ways and others will. So more to come. That for the teacher.
Any further questions? Thank both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
See you again.
We'll see you in January, if not before. Item 4.02, Instructional Calendar Committee.
All right, this is another one that is going to be a presentation leading to future conversations, but we've had this committee that's been getting together, the Instructional Calendar Task Force, and I want to be able to share with you some updates. And I like being able to see all of you when I'm presenting, so that's what I'm doing. So I don't know if we're supposed to do that or not, but it's one. So overarching goal of this task force was to be able to identify Mechanicsburg's philosophical values around the development of the district instructional calendar with student learning as the priority. This was something that, for a number of reasons I'll talk about in the next couple of slides, it was just time for us to take a look at this and to have some real conversations about what do we philosophically believe about our instructional calendar. So we have had an evolution of our calendar, but there's also a lot about our calendar that hasn't changed in a long time. That sounds somewhat contradictory, but for many years we have really just taken our previous calendar and kind of rolled it over. We had the same process. We took it to professional ed, we took it to A-team, took it to different groups and got feedback and ultimately said, okay, I think we got the right mix. When's Christmas? How many days do we have off? And we figured it all out around there. But we also have, especially since COVID, had some minor evolutions, and law has changed as well that has allowed us to have some minor evolutions. So for example, during COVID, we experienced that through that hybrid learning, which there were lots of things that we didn't like about, but we had those Wednesdays where everybody was at home, all students were at home. And one of the lessons learned from COVID was a lot of staff came back in professional ed and so many different groups of people came back and said, you know what, having those regular periods through the school year where it's really focused on being able to plan collaboratively and being able to do some of this curriculum work, which at the time was completely redoing the curriculum for hybrid learning, but being able to do that with some regular intervals has some value and it has some purpose. We recognize we're not going to do it every week like we did that year, but having those regular opportunities had value. So ultimately that led to us increasing the number of Act 80 days that we were using in the calendar to the point where we had a day like that, at least a day like that, pretty much once a month. And under our current CBA, some of those days were called professional development days, some were called Act 80, some were called contracted in-service. I think I got all the different names for them there. The opening day, records review day, we got a number of different names there. But we were able to infuse those throughout the calendar to be able to provide this opportunity for some collaboration. At the same time, we also, well, I shouldn't say at the same time, more recently, we had a change in the PA school code. One word change, and you probably remember Dr. Lay talking a little bit about this, about one word was going to have a huge potential impact. So very quietly, at the end of the calendar year, I believe 2 years ago, PA school code changed on a whim from 180 days and 990 hours to 180 days or 990 hours. That's a significant change because as we always created the calendar, we had to account for the fact that our students had 180 days accounted for, but we also had to make sure that the number of hours were accounted for. And that's where I won't go into all the ugly details I did with the task force, and we certainly can if you want to, but that's where Act 80 time came in, because Act 80 days could count as an instructional day, even though students weren't in school. We could allow it to count as an instructional day, but we couldn't count it as instructional hours. So we could say, okay, well, we're keeping students at home. This is going to be an Act 80 day, so it counts as one of our 180. And as long as we have enough hours overall, as long as we're still hitting the 900 and 990, we can keep students at home. And we can do that because ultimately our day is long enough at each one of our buildings that over the course of 180 days, we actually accumulate far more than 900 or 990 hours. So you can kind of play with that difference, if you will, by saying, okay, well, here's some of these days that are going to count as a day, but students aren't really here doing anything. They're going to stay at home. So that change was significant. And ultimately, another piece that I didn't even put up there was this idea of what does inclement weather days look like. And we know there was another law by the state that allowed for these things called FID days, flexible instructional days, which was the idea that you could, up to 5 days, allow students to learn from home if you were having an inclement weather closure, and that way it still would count as that day and count as those instructional hours, and you didn't have to worry about making up the day. So actually last year was the first time we ever did one of those remote days. It feels like we had more than that because during COVID, obviously, we had remote days. But last year was the first time that we had an inclement weather remote day. And obviously, there were lots of growing pains, and there were obviously lots of opinions on it. Some people loved it, some people hated it. But again, that was some of the impetus for us to bring this group together to have some discussion about what do we believe, that being one of the issues. So we brought together a task force, which was a group of administrators, teachers, we had a support staff member, we had some folks who were strictly from the parent lens. We also had other staff members who are also parents in the district. And we also had Mrs. Huff as our curriculum contact serve as a school board representative on the task force as well. So we had 3 meetings to be able to discuss philosophy, and ultimately the goal was that we would have some of these philosophical underpinnings for what do we believe about the calendar, that then we would be able to refine a little bit, and then ultimately take back to apply to the 25-26 calendar, and then go through some of the normal process with the 25-26 calendar to be able to say, okay, here's the calendar that we'll bring here to the board for you all to approve. So we're at the stage right now where we've had those 3 meetings, we are sharing and refining the philosophy, and based on the feedback that we're receiving in those conversations, then we'll be able to apply that to the 25-26 calendar. So what were some of the questions that we were asking related to instructional time? How should we approach instructional time in order to maximize learning? At its simplest form, you could say, should we go for 180 or should we go for 900, 990? And by the way, 900, 990, that's because in K through 5, you need 900 hours, and in 6 through 12, you need 990 hours. Actually, if you only have a half-day kindergarten program, you only need 450 hours. But we've asked the state, as soon as you declare yourself as full day, you have to have 900 hours, even though if you say you're half-day, then you only have to have 450. Seems true, but it's start date and end date. So when should we aim to start the school year? So we've traditionally, for a long time, been looking at that week before Memorial Day as a 4-day week. Is that where we should continue to start the school year? When should we end the school year? Again, we've traditionally been looking at that first or second week of June. Is that what we believe is best? Professional development and staff only time. How should we approach this? Is this something that we should continue with this kind of 1 day a month kind of approach? Is that something that has worked for us over these last 3 or 4 years, or is that something that we need to reevaluate? Quite frankly, and you'll see it in a couple slides, also substitute issues play into that. We know that substitutes are extremely hard to come by, so that we can't have the same kind of pull-out time as what we used to back in the day to be able to pull staff during the year in order to do different curriculum and planning work. Time off for all. What rhythm of days should students and staff both be off? And it kind of goes into the next one, overall rhythm of calendar. How should the calendar flow? Should we have a few long breaks or short breaks? What do we want to see the calendar look like in terms of the particular days we're looking to have off for everyone, and how should that flow across the year? And then ultimately, of course, that school closure piece, how should we handle instructional time impacted by those closures? So my plan is to share with you now an overview of the guiding principles, gather any feedback that this group has, and then again, after Thanksgiving, we'll be looking to begin applying the feedback to potential 25-26 calendar. So with regard to instructional time, I've just kind of pulled out some snippets of these. This is actually a document that the task force has reviewed multiple times to be able to refine. But I'm trying to give you the summary version here tonight. So instructional time, we believe that MASD prioritizes in-person learning for students. It's a basic statement, but I think it's important to lead with. We prioritize this. We believe it's the most effective and important type of learning. Remote learning as a substitute for in-person learning should be reserved for unique situations. And I think some really important points about this were made, and it's what made us bring in the language of as a substitute for in-person learning, and the actual full statement talks about this differs from the idea that, especially at the high school level, we have some programs and some courses that are designed to have some remote learning as a part of them. They are hybrid courses that are designed to have some activities and even some class periods that are done outside of the in-person environment. We view that as different than remote learning here, again, as a last-minute substitute, if you will, for in-person learning when we're talking about snow days. Staff-only time, we believe that it should be driven by purpose as much as possible, that the timing, the frequency of it, we want to allow our purpose to drive that. We do believe that, we know that we have to be able to use staff-only time to minimize pulling staff out of the classroom. Substitutes, frankly, just aren't available for us to be able to use for that purpose. We also know that, quite frankly, there is no substitute to a classroom teacher being in the classroom with their class of students. So if there is work that needs to be done to plan for a course, if there is collaborative planning that needs to occur, we want to do as much of that as possible in a staff-only day format, whether that's before the school year, after the school year, or in the middle of the school year. We want that to happen as much as possible there, as opposed to having to pull people out of the classroom. Half days is an interesting one. I would say it was received half support. So there's folks that say, yes, we should do some half days. We should have students here for a chunk of the day. That way they're at least touching base with their teachers. They can get breakfast if they need breakfast, maybe even take home lunch. And then the second half of the day, we could do some planning or professional development. And the other half of the group said, those are so unproductive afternoons, because the reality is that even after you're teaching for a half day, to be able to suddenly flip the switch and now do 3 hours of good curriculum work is almost impossible. And also, how much are students even really getting from that half day of school if you're reducing class time and all that sort of thing? Is it really effective? So half and half. But what we did say was that there are certainly some things, some activities where half days make a lot of sense. So right now we do it for some of our exam periods where students are coming in just to take some exams and then are going home. We do it for conferences. Again, it makes a lot of sense to be able to say we only need the afternoon to facilitate conferences. So there are some very specific purposes that already it makes sense to use that as a format, and something we should explore some more. And finally, asynchronous PD. We know that asynchronous PD for staff is something that already works pretty well for mandated trainings. We do it for quite a lot of our mandated trainings. I think it's something that we need to continue to explore. How could we use that effectively for staff, maybe in some of these snow days where we have to close for inclement weather? Is doing some sort of asynchronous PD for staff an option? We have to have greater structure and accountability built around that. But I think we can, and I think that is something that in the future we'll be able to do some of. Rhythm of calendar, it was mentioned that balancing across the semesters is important because we do have semester classes throughout the secondary level. Consistency, trying to develop some consistency year to year so that families know what to expect in general. This is generally when we start the school year, this is generally when we finish, this is generally what we can expect as days off during the year. Beginning, we've gotten a lot of bang for our buck out of easing into the school year with 3-day week, 3-day week, 4-day week, 5-day week, or 4-day week, 4-day week, 5-day week, being able to ease into things. The staggered start at kindergarten, there's discussion of, is it doing what we need it to do in the other primary grade levels? I think that's something for primary to continue to look, but in general, easing into the school year is beneficial. Trying to have some preserved breaks. The task force talked a lot about how do we have at least a break in the fall and at least a break in the spring that we know is preserved. For so many years, I know the Easter break, the spring break, quite frankly, is one where we would have a makeup day often on the Thursday, and even for a number of years we had a makeup day on the Friday. So instead of having what would have been a nice long weekend there during the spring, suddenly you're down to really just having Friday off and then the normal Saturday and Sunday. So trying to preserve those breaks and seeing if we're going to include makeup days, include those in other places as opposed to taking away that preserved break. And then ending as close to Memorial Day for students as possible. So in all likelihood, ending before Memorial Day would be pretty difficult to manage. I know some school districts are able to figure it out that way. But ending for students as close to Memorial Day as really kind of the, somebody called it, I think it might have been Mr. Yu, the psychological start to summer for many people. Recognizing that whenever the end is, the last few days before the end are always going to be the last few days before the end. And there's always going to be a reduced amount of productivity happening on those days. But ultimately being able to finish with students closer to Memorial Day is preferred. Also making sure that we're constantly touching base with childcare and making sure that if we're making some swings in the calendar, that we're talking to recreation, we're talking to MLC and other providers to be able to say, here's some of the shifts that we're trying to make. How will you be able to support families with this change? Then finally, the approach to closures. So really believe that depending on the year, number of snow days, all those different kinds of things, that multiple approaches may be necessary. in order to be able to address school closures. But we do believe that the order of preference should be first, if built-in snow days, meaning that a snow day is just a snow day and we don't have to make up anything because we have enough instructional hours, that's awesome. We could have 1 or 2 of those where it's just a snow day, it just is what it is, and we keep on keeping on. That's great. Second option being if we do have to make it up, then so be it. And then if we do get into a situation where we need to infuse some remote days for whatever reason, that would be the last option or preference within the 3.
Dr. Fitz,
Please.
on the makeup with the new law, with the or as opposed to and.
Yeah.
So say we had a 180-day student calendar, but we met the hours in 172 of those days.
Yes.
We could actually have, the other ones could be snow days or inclement weather days. Just, we don't have to go, like in years past, we used to have 182 days.
Correct.
To build it. Now we could do it within 180, as long as we make the hours.
As long as we're focused
Under
on
the current interpretation of the.
Yes, and specifically for students, that would be true.
Correct.
That's where the difference between the staff and the CBA number of days and the student is different. But for students, yes, you're absolutely right. Because we would have met the hours, we could just go 179 and not have to worry about anything.
Right, then the only outstanding issue would be with the CBA and with staff as far as, right.
Thank you. So, I don't know if I can go back. Sorry, Paul. I think I clicked too far. Thank you, sir. Nope. That's all right. I can add that. So ultimately, again, love to hear any other feedback you have from what I shared. Obviously, I just gave you a snapshot of a lot of discussion over 3 different meetings. I'm going to continue to gather feedback and then apply it to a calendar to see what we can come up with for 25, 26, and potentially even look ahead to 26, 27 a little bit, because some of the changes that we are talking about might need a little bit of a transition in order to be able to balance out some summers. And we already have contracted in-service days reserved with staff for this upcoming summer to be trade-offs for next year. So for example, if that were something that we weren't going to do, trade-offs or something like that, that would have to wait until the following. But any feedback that you have is more than welcome.
So you are not recommending go to school 12 months a year?
We had some conversation about it. We talked about it in round robin. We went to some posters, had lots of discussion. The reality is that there are too many systems outside of our own that would conflict with. When you talk about the number of students who are, all those external opportunities that we've worked so hard to do at the secondary level are all based on the same school calendar that our university partners have and our area school districts have. Our consortium classes that rely on what the other school districts that we partner with go on, our outside placements. So as soon as you start unraveling that, you realize how many other systems, if we were to have that dramatic of a shift, how that would impact with all those other systems. A week or 2, that's the kind of thing that, yes, some other districts start a week or 2 earlier than what we do, and it works out okay. But to start to say we're going to have a chunk of time, in late June and in early August, and that's when it starts to really mismatch.
That's kind of what I was thinking when you said you want to be done Memorial Day, so you're almost cutting it back a week or a week and a half to what we're doing now. So you're going to start a week earlier?
We'd have to, in all likelihood. There were a few years that we had early on in the construction projects. We started the week prior, somewhere in the 19-ish, 18 date range, depending on the year. And then we went back to the 4 and 4, being 4 days before Labor Day, 4 days after Labor Day. But I think if we're going to try and use that as the benchmark, close to Memorial Day, maybe the Friday after Memorial Day, then we're going to have to start a little bit earlier.
On Mrs. Morgan's question of blowing it up more than just moving a day or 2 around. Did you consider, I don't know, adding 10 minutes onto the end of the day? I get that there's CBA implications and all that, but the idea of make up 2 weeks at the end of the year by going 10 minutes longer a day or something like that.
Yeah, so we did. You're bringing up great points. The challenge, as soon as you start talking about playing with the day, is transportation. Honestly, not even necessarily the CBA implications, because you start looking at where do we. Honestly, we are well over the number of hours in secondary. Well over. We're well over the number of hours at Elmwood. Where we're closest to the number of hours where we could really use a little bit more time is at kindergarten and the primary, and especially kindergarten. Because of the way that our day is structured right now, kindergarten is the first puzzle piece to the entire rest of the transportation system. So even to add much time there at kindergarten wreaks a lot of havoc on the rest of that schedule, day in and day out. So it doesn't mean that a couple minutes can't be added here or there, but in order to do much wholesale change there would really require a big shift in transportation.
We've only had the current transportation set up for 6 years though. Like,
Yeah.
and if the goal was some sort of, if there was some better student outcome, like if we're well over the instructional hours, but there's room to grow in testing results, then maybe that's like, if there is, I don't know, there's more to be done. Maybe it isn't more time in school, I don't know, but I would be interested in, I don't know, I'm not against something broader than this. I get there's a whole lot of downstream implications. You'd answered the question on like the other providers. I get that you can only kind of work in a certain box, but what you described of like kindergarten, runs the rest of transportation, that's like our box that we can.
It's,
It's a pretty expensive box though, when if you change the transportation for kindergarten because of the shuttle, right? Well, I don't know if you call it a shuttle anymore, but the fourth and fifth, because
I
that's
know
adding
what
how
you're
many
talking
new buses that are each costing, I don't know, thousands?
I don't
Some
mean
big
just change
number.
kindergarten. I mean, I would understand you'd change all 3 buses or whatever the runs. Maybe.
ultimately, the downstream impact is in order to add any significant amount of time to kindergarten, we're already as tight of a window between our first bus run for the elementaries as we can be between the secondaries. In fact, at the high school, there's some buses that come in just a couple minutes before the bell rings at the high school. So if we were to add any time at all to expand that elementary day, then that would push the secondary day a good bit further than, and suddenly now secondary, instead of getting out at 3:20ish, they may not be getting out until 3:45 or even later. So then the implications start to become, okay, what does that mean for after-school activities, for after-school sports, and the connections we have with other schools there. So again, not impossible from a few minutes, and it was something we talked about, but not sure that the bang is worth a buck to shift that.
It's like a Rubik's Cube.
For sure.
But there are countries out there that do it, so.
But it requires everybody to say, this is what we're doing now.
One little section
Oh, I
is
know.
doing it and everybody else is doing something different. If
It's
collectively
gonna be
you
a
said
global
everybody in the
change.
state of Pennsylvania did it, and then you'd have to have the around the fringes of the state where they border other states, then you run into issues, so you've got to really have more of a national momentum than just one little area doing it. Yeah.
Any other feedback, pressure points? Great questions you're asking. I don't provide a quick answer to suggest that the question is invaluable, but we have had those discussions, so I can provide some quick answers.
I do have a question. It's like, it seemed very important for people to end close to Memorial Day, but I'm surprised you don't get pushback on the other end. Like, now you're going to ask people to start 2 weeks earlier than Labor Day, and to me, that, I wouldn't want
Sure,
those 2
South
weeks.
Carolina time.
Yeah, I know.
There was
The South does start.
I would say that
Right.
there was a ceiling there, if you will, or a floor, depending on how you looked at it, of not wanting to push our induction week into July. So there is a point at which we can start earlier and still have our staff week and have induction all within August. So kind of a little bit of a middle ground to still get our student end closer to Memorial Day, but not push that front end up into July.
So, in respect for time, I just real quickly is, why is there a push to be done sooner, knowing you have to start sooner? What's the benefit? Like, what was the rationale, I guess is the better word?
That's what I'm trying to figure out why.
I would say
I'd
lack
rather
of-
have August off than.
Lack of productivity in June.
Doesn't that exist on a sliding scale? I mean, when you get to the end of something, isn't it?
Exactly, it certainly is, but I do think that there's a psychological aspect to weather's getting warm out, we're in the middle of May, they're wrapping up, and as you get to that Memorial Day, as you get to those few days after that, you just feel it. That first week in May, as soon as those warm weather days start to hit, just changes, and I think our staff, pretty much unanimously talked about that the closer we can get to that Memorial Day benchmark, the better.
The other part of the frustration might be my neighboring communities are done, and I'm still going to school. And there's no that consistency, like, how come they're done and they're out already?
Right.
Not remembering the fact that they started a week before you, you just remember they're out before you.
That's because you were
And
still
you're
at the
still
beach
going.
when they were in
Yeah,
school.
so you're still going, and it's like, why am I still going? And then that just puts that extra level of frustration.
But he's right, May is tough, June becomes impossible. It's like,
From a
they get
teacher's,
things really
you're
done.
saying from a teacher's viewpoint.
Yeah.
I will have to say, the feedback that I have gotten from a particular member of this process said that she went in with that person, I should say, went in with a certain perspective and came out with an entirely different perspective and was really pleased with the process that you went through and the work that's been done and the setup, so.
That's reassuring to hear that the process is working.
Yes. And that person is tough sometimes, that's all.
Very good.
Good luck.
Thank
you. Making everybody happy.
It's an opportunity for them.
Good opportunity.
All right, with that, we'll move on to 4.03, new course proposal, personal finance. Mr. Bitts.
Yes, we're going to be turning over this first one to Mr. Reedy.
Good evening. It's good to see you all today. Any opportunity I'm up here, I just want to say thank you for serving our district. I live here and work here, and it's an honor to always talk with you. I am honored to present a new course coming online at MASH. That would be the proposal course. That's personal finance. It's on one hand the state back in 2023, and it's been going on in legislation for a long time. But Act 35 presented this opportunity of enacting a requirement financial literacy education for high school students for 0.5 credits. Of course, I think we're all aware of the importance of financial literacy. And I remember coming up here today, I was remembering back when I was 8 years old and my first job, and my dad taught me about the value of a dollar. And he taught me some basic skills as a young kid that I still think about today. And truly, when we look at our mission and our vision, I think that financial piece is critical for our students as the world becomes even more complex and the world kind of shifts to digital banking and sometimes with digital processes, the mindset and the process of just how to think financially and to make informed decisions sometimes can go by the wayside. So excited to present this offering here. A lot of work has gone into the process by Adjournment sitting behind me and her team as well. We do have a course on the course program for MASH. It's been on the books for a long time called Personal Finance. It's a major offering. It meets every day. It's a semester-based course. The proposal here is that it'd be offered to all 10th graders. It would be offered on a semester-based approach. It'd be offered in the second semester. And then we have the opportunity to offer it to all of our seniors. And that would be offered and delivered during the first semester. A lot of rationale and intentionality went in behind the timing of that. If you think about it, a senior, their first semester of senior year, they're thinking about some big decisions. They're thinking about post-high school planning. They're thinking about their part-time jobs. They're thinking about life after MASH and what all is considered to be a part of that. For a 10th grader, think about some of the decisions that a 15, 16-year-old student makes at that time. It might be the purchase of a car. It might be their first part-time job. And actually, a lot of our students are interested in investments. So it really is a neat opportunity as we talk about MASH vision, vision for high school programming. Where can we guarantee programming that all students receive every year? So if you remember our career development program, that is freshmen, that's their first semester. That kind of continues the conversation about career exploration and challenges they want to take on in the world and you know, their journey and refinement, and they have it again as a junior, their second semester. We have PE offered each year, of course. We have health offered different times in the high school experience. And now we have this proposal for personal finance. I'll share here that the curriculum was really developed and overhauled last year by Ms. Brubaugh and the crew. There are transfer goals that exist. If you look at some of the questions, the central questions there are things there that I would simply ask a financial advisor for yesterday. There are things I would love to go back as a high school student to learn more about, to why starting a 403B the first day I started teaching would have been a better decision than waiting for a long time. I love the fact that there's some rich standards connected to this experience, and there's beautiful connections to careers. That's been a surge of development at the high school over the last few years as that curriculum has been enhanced. There are intentional opportunities in personal finance to speak to a student's interest perhaps in fields and see what kind of income is from that, or to see how their interest can be matched up to that. So that's the course in a nutshell.
You said you're gonna offer it 2 times in the lifehood of a student at the high school. Are you gonna teach it differently to the 10th grader, to the senior?
Yeah, great question. The audience, the reality of where they're at, the condition for learning there, and their readiness at each point, it's going to be different skill sets that each student will get and understandings that they'll work toward. Similar though in the approach with the transfer goal, and I think that's the opportunity as a senior, they would have built upon what they learned as a sophomore, for sure. Yeah.
The way I've explained it, and it's probably too simplistic, Mrs. Brubaugh probably hates it when I describe it this way, but when you think about a sophomore, they're thinking about getting their car, paying for gas, having their first job.
Date money.
Date money, right? How can we provide them with the skills to be able to have those initial decision-making points? And then a senior, obviously, as you pointed out, they're making those post-secondary decisions, and now the monetary value becomes exponential. So
it's great that we have this, but as you talked about, we've had this for forever already, so it's annoying that we have to do this way. To have everyone feel better that they suddenly gave us something we already are doing. But my question then is, are we removing this? Like you aren't gonna have to learn how to balance your checkbook in 3 other classes if you're kind of in working through business as well. Is that kind of are we removing the major class, and are we not having as much overlap with stuff that we've already done for forever?
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah, that's the conversations that we're having with our teams as we look at curriculum and see different opportunities that might teach similar content. It actually gives an opportunity. I'll give you an example. 11th grade social studies, they teach economics, and there's been quite a lot of work over the last few years to infuse everything from how to create a budget to investment portfolios. It actually creates an opportunity in those subjects to go further and deeper, and perhaps 10th grade experience then relays into 11th grade econ class where they can think about macroeconomics or think about micro level decisions, and then that could kind of spin to senior year where they're now going back to the micro aspect. And so I think there's a natural connection there. In terms of the major, the personal finance class that would meet, I think that could offer other opportunities in our curriculum process, see what else is out there. If you recall, we day 6 now, we're going to have a number of opportunities on deck next school year, and one of them is introduction to investment. And so that's kind of the wheelhouse. I think we're going in that realm of new possibilities.
Yeah, I commend us trying to have kids understand finances better than they have in the past, and all the more that we can teach them. Because my 30-year-old daughter will say, that's the one class she says she missed or something in high school. She goes, why didn't they teach us this? I'm like, what do you mean?
When I say I'm annoyed at this, Morgan, it's because it exists. It's not, I'm annoyed that it's like saying, well, why don't we do cursive? And my 5th grader is doing cursive. It's like, okay, that's where it's not. I'm glad you guys are doing this. It's not, it's just the idea that I have someone I graduated with said that was the best class they took, and that they were able to be organized and start their savings early and all that stuff because of that, and they went here. So I know it exists, and you just had to. I'm glad everybody is getting this instead of having to accidentally kind of stumble into it or not. That's good. I hope we're not all. There's some good ripples into the rest of them.
Yeah. And I'll speak to that there. It's been in the works for a while. It's been kind of tinkered about, and actually we'll look at opportunities when driver's ed kind of changed paths a little bit in that direction. And that's still an opportunity that our students get to learn the theory behind it. But that meant two times throughout a 6-day cycle for a sophomore, given a semester. So when we changed gears a little bit, that actually opened up the door to years ago to kind of think, well, what if we proposed something with finance degree so that every kid can experience that? I'm proud of that with your consideration if this is something that we can do.
I like the class quite a bit. I just noticed that it does say add a position, so we'll see that in the budget later.
Yes.
Just wanted to point that out.
Yes. Yep, but implied intent to add.
Is that small print?
That part of the
Request.
answer. That
Well,
little
that's
part
one of
about
the unintended
position.
consequences to Mr. Sanger's point. The state, though, mandating it is
Right.
Yeah,
schools
that
then have to
is-
creatively figure out, because now you've mandated for every kid, you've exponentially increased the sections that you have to cover. So how do you handle that? So every high school is going to be facing that dilemma.
Any other questions?
Thanks, good.
We're going to move this forward to December.
December, yes.
Thank you, I appreciate
Thank
it.
Thank you. We appreciate you too.
Thank you.
Item 4.04, proposal for amended course, media communications.
Yeah, this one's a little bit of a different one. You could probably argue one way or the other, did it need to come forward for approval or not? But we felt like there was a significant enough change in direction here that it was appropriate to bring forward as an amended course. We've long had a journalism course that Mrs. Atkinson is going to talk about, and for a number of reasons, again, that I'm sure she'll talk about, there's some reasons why we really need to look at making some shifts with that course. Yes.
Hey, thank you very much. I made it through the whole semester totally healthy and woke up this morning just in time for break. So please excuse my voice this evening. Yeah, I started teaching Mechanicsburg 13 years ago, and I remember once a month getting a paper copy of The Torch. That's gone. now it's digital. And I can remember looking at other school district websites and seeing their digital newspapers and, kind of wondering, and we're here at this point. Journalism as it currently exists is a minor elective. What we're looking to do is revamp it into a major elective. And so we're taking it from print-focused journalism to digital media media communications. And so what does it look like in this 21st century? What does journalism look like? The units that we're offering, we're still gonna have that intro to journalism. What is that? Getting into broadcast journalism and then digital journalism. I asked a class of my seniors a couple weeks ago without telling them any other context, obviously. I said, what words do you associate if I say the words media communications to you? And they responded by saying, those things that pop up on Google when I search something, but it's a news article. And I thought, well, that's actually really quite telling. And then they said stuff like news and journalism, and someone said it sounds like a college major. And I said, well, that's kind of because it is. And so what media communications, I'm sorry, I keep looking at the word digital, I'm so Dana. What it does is it allows students not only to learn how to create media and with a journalistic approach, but also at the same time, how to analyze the constant bombardment of media that they are consuming on a daily basis. One of the things that I love so much about the course is that regardless of whether it's grades 6 through 12, students in English core classes are getting digital literacy in some way, shape, or form, right? We're constantly looking at ways to help students learn to evaluate and critically think about what they're seeing. And what this elective does is it allows us to go just a little bit deeper. And for those students who are feeling a career pull toward, either communications or journalism, there's so many different realms. It will give them some exposure and some experience and give them the opportunity to explore. And I think about the work we've been doing with careers and to have a course that we can then offer them in a more 21st century style than we have in the past. With some room for growth as well, which is one of the things that's really cool about designing a course like this is that, we have all of the standards and we have the questions, but then you bring the kids in and you kind of see where it can take you. We've got the new equipment at the high school, we've got a studio going in up there, and it can really grow into be anything. But that's kind of where we are right now as far as the course currently exists. It needs a 21st century makeover, which is pretty much what this would give it.
I totally agree that this career has changed dramatically even in my tenure of working, that I went from a print to it's all digital now, so it's totally changed.
Nothing, ma'am.
What did I say?
Mr. Bradley was picking up.
Because I was old and dealt with print. But you're just as old, so. But just the fact how many newspapers are around anymore. So it's just it's eye-opening, and I think kids in school today have no idea what it used to be like. So.
Well, again, building on Mrs. Morgan's comments, what do you see then as you're making this into a major or a bigger part where we're preparing kids for in the future with less and less as journalism, kind of changes and evolves and shrinks?
I'm sorry, could you?
What's the career path look like for this? What are we, we're spending more time and talking to the students about this. How does this look when the journalism career path is shrinking as a overall, avenue?
I think interestingly, while it's shrinking in its traditional form, it's morphing and it's changing into something different. And I think about how many times I've been tasked with a grade level team to create a curriculum for the jobs that we don't know exist yet. And I think this is one of those courses where it's not so much about, here's how you go do this. Here's how you can go be a media communicator. It's more, here's what it looks like in the 21st century. Here's how they're putting things together digitally. Here's how, with the ethics that surround that. Here's how you analyze what surrounds that, so that when you go out and you recognize that it comes down to sharing information in an ethical way. I don't know that I would be able to tell a student, here's the job we're preparing you for. And I think that the fact that that our media is constantly changing so quickly is testament to that. And so we're not necessarily, I don't think, equipping them for a specific career, but more here are the possibilities and the options. And you can take these skills and see where they might take you. Some of which we don't, I mean, my daughter looked at being a social media marketing minor at college. I mean, that wasn't even something that existed, 15 years ago, possibly even 10. So I think it's more making them aware of what the field looks like and how it works. And for me, just from my own perspective, it's that analysis piece that I see as almost more important than the actual practical of, okay, here's how I put together a newscast. More, what does it look like? What are the things we consider? And how do I consume media and then also then create it?
I think that's an excellent answer. I have a daughter-in-law who's a writer, and she makes her own jobs based on the skills she has and the things that she needs, based on everything you just said. Those
And it's something that a lot of seniors kind of don't quite grasp yet. Like they're not there to the point where they realize they're developing skills versus they're so focused on, but here's what I want to be, versus no, you're going to probably make what you're going to be using everything we're trying to teach you. But they're 18, so we do the best we can.
Right. And it's also changed that they're looking for quick snippets. They're not looking for the in-depth research, multiple pages of an article. They're looking for, in short period of time, give me those high points, give me the key things that I can walk away with, and I want to know it now, instead of having to take time and really dig down. And I can also take the time if I want to, but more of them are looking for. And when they talk about the surveys of where kids are getting their news these days, they're not getting their news from large organizations. They're getting their news from these quick hits, these quick snippets that they're receiving all the time. So
I think podcasts are going to boom here too, more so than they are right now. But I think that's going to be the new digital media.
I would agree. I mean, I know in some of our English courses we have the kids play around a little bit with podcasts as options for assessments. They haven't taken off among students in a way that I thought they would have, but I also think it's because for a while there, podcasting was kind of on the newer side. They're becoming more succinct now, to your point, and it's not just I'm going to listen to someone ramble for 45 minutes because no one has the patience for that. Much to your point, where they need to understand this is how we do it in a way that also appeals to our audience. Because you may have that thing you want to rabbit hole down, but if your audience doesn't feel like listening to you talk about, minerals for 90 minutes, you're not going to have an audience.
I just have a couple specific questions. So journalism is the title of journalism is now becoming media communications, is that
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
And then also, when it says course prerequisite, it says 9th grade, meaning second, I don't understand what that means, 9th grade, comma, second semester students.
Oh, so what we wanted to
What's
do,
it mean?
because we want to have electives available for 9th grade, but we also want them to get used to the high school first,
Okay.
we kind of morphed that into and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's that the freshmen can take it second semester.
Okay.
Because it is a 9-12 class as well, I mean, there's still a difference if I've got a senior sitting next to a freshman, but at least that second semester, they've had a semester to adjust, and they've had 3 to 4 classes where they're kind of getting used to, the norms of the building and that sort of thing. So that way they've got options, but it's not just it's your first day of school, you've never been on a block schedule before, and here's media communications with that.
Thank you. It doesn't say any staffing implications.
As far as
question every time now.
No, I know. I don't think necessarily that we would have any right now. I mean, we haven't started talking about that a whole lot yet. We do have a little bit of flexibility in the department. I know Megan Heisler has really worked very hard at writing the course. She would be my first choice to kind of pilot it off there. But there is, I think, a little bit of flexibility. Don't quote me for that. I'm not sure how long that flexibility is going to last, but I think, just for going into next year, like if we ran even 2 sections of it, we could, well, maybe one section of it, I think would probably work. But yeah, I don't think it's an immediate need to hire, unless obviously you'd love to see a course take off.
Right.
I wouldn't anticipate that straight out of the gate, though. Kids aren't quite sure stuff.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Further questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful break.
Thank
you.
you.
Well, holiday.
We feel good moving forward for future discussion, vote in December. Okay. All right. Item 7, policy. Item 7.01, first reading of revised board policy 008, table of organization. Dr. Pitts.
Yeah, not much to discuss on this one. It's just our annual update of the table of organization. This reflects the changes to Mrs. Ely being brought into her position, which you approved last time, and some reorganization on page 5 of the document there in district operations that reflects that change.
Any questions? Item 7.02, first reading of revised board policy 113.5, independent education evaluations. Dr. Pitts.
I'll turn it over to Mr. Bingham for what's just a short change there too.
Okay, as the board's aware, we just went through our special education audit, although we don't have our full report of recommendations coming from the audit. One of the things that came out of that was a recommendation from the Pennsylvania Department of Education Bureau of Special Education to add a statement within our policy, our current policy 113.5. 113.5 is not a PSBA policy. It is a split of 113.3, where 113.3 and 113.5 together make the policy that is recommended by PSBA. But back in 2003, we opted based upon a recommendation from our then solicitor to split the policy. But the recommended change is on page 4, which is to add a specific statement relevant to the fact that when we receive a request for independent educational evaluation, that we formalize that request. If we reject the independent educational evaluation request in writing in either a prior written notice or a notice of recommended educational placement. So before the board this evening is the revised policy 113.5 with that addition. If you have a question relevant to the highlighted change on page 2 of the policy, that is a current addition, well, that is a current statement that is in 113.5 that is not in the PSBA policy of part 13.3. That was added back in 2013 just to ensure that there was not a conflict of interest between the request of the independent educational evaluation and a connection to the district and the process. That was left highlighted and showcased just in case somebody would go back into 113.3 and say, well, that doesn't mirror a match. I wanted to honor that change that was made in 2013 and represent it on page 2. But the only recommended change moving forward is on page 4 of 113.5.
Any questions? Thank you much.
Thank you.
And I'm now going to read the next 3 in as they're all tied together. It'll be easier for Dr. Pitts to present them. And item 7.03, first reading of revised board policy 707, use of school facilities. 7.04, delete board policy 707.2, John H. Frederick Field at Memorial Stadium. 7.05, delete board policy 707.3, Trails and Trees Environmental Center. Dr. Pitts.
Yeah, so one last presentation. You're hanging in there well. Some big topics here before we obviously don't have a work session in December. So opportunity for us to hit this one as well, which we talked a little bit about before, but want to have obviously the official first reading of the policy. And with this one, we thought some presentation along with it was appropriate. So we'll start with Mr. Longwell, and he and I will tag team this again as we have a little bit in the past.
Thank you, Dr. Pitts. The first few slides are probably a little bit of a drawback to prior presentations, and so just as a reminder, why are we examining facility use? Really, I think it gets to an acknowledgement that we have new facilities in that we've done renovations, we've added on And so just as an example, at our elementaries, we now have multi-purpose rooms at all 6 of our elementaries. We've one of the fastest growing school districts in the state. When you look back at 8, 10, 12-year benchmarks, growing enrollment, we've added probably something about 20% in enrollment. And so that obviously has, how do you best serve those students? What programs do they have? What's access and opportunity look like? Additional programmatic needs. And so that's an acknowledgement that over the years, there have been new programs have evolved, things of that nature. And then finally, an acknowledgement that there's some inequity in prior practices. And so just to be completely vulnerable, I think when you look at the 3 policies we have, even on the agenda this evening, we have one policy around facility use, we had a policy at Memorial Stadium, we had a policy at the East Center, and then where were we with our ARs, how did we classify the groups, what did consistency look like across the fee schedules, and so there was an opportunity there to say, how can we standardize some practices and look for like that thread of consistency the entire way through. So as we started out studying facility use, we created a committee on facility use. So that included Dr. Bitts, it included myself, Mr. Bohanec is our athletic director, Mr. Hoffman is our facilities director, Mrs. Herron is our recreation director. I think those 5 are probably key stakeholders, at least administratively, in terms of how our facilities are used, how do we process requests, but obviously they're talking to their stakeholder groups as well, stakeholders as in departments and fellow colleagues. Then within that, we also had a roundtable with community partners, which included a meeting with, I'll say, a representative group of organizations. It wasn't necessarily meant to, we're going to meet with every single organization that uses our facilities, but rather, how can we get a representative group in to just talk a little bit about facility use? And then also some meetings with our municipal partners, particularly Upper Allen Township and Mechanicsburg Borough. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bitts. And
yeah, I'll highlight, as he talked about the why, I'll highlight what wasn't mentioned there. This wasn't to turn a profit. This isn't to make more money out of facility usage. It's not in an effort to push anyone out of our facilities or to have any of our facilities priced in a way that we organically push people out. We want people to continue to use our facilities. And quite frankly, with the changes in this policy, there's no reason that all the groups that have used our facilities won't be able to continue to use our facilities. Ultimately, what we recognized was that we have a broken, inequitable system that hasn't been working the way that it really should be for a school district our size especially. So that really begins with group classification, and shared with you before, we've got, and you see it in the policies, there's 4 groups, there's 5 groups, there's 6 groups, depending on the facility that you're looking at. We want to condense that to 3 different groups, with the first one being specifically for district programs and MASD nonprofits, meaning Wildcat Foundation, Operation Wildcat, MAPTO, MABC, MMA, so those nonprofits that work with our district. The second group, which would receive a reduced rate, so everybody in group 2 and group 3 are outside organizations. But we believe that there are some organizations and groups that, because of the nature of them, that there is such a connection to our mission and our community that they should receive a reduced rate. And those are organizations that are geared specifically to support our district, some of the civic organizations within our area, and then district taxpayers and employees that are looking to be able to use our facilities for personal use. And then group 3 ultimately being all other organizations. And again, that's not to say that we're looking to price them out of doing anything, but we believe group 2 should be able to use our facilities for a slightly reduced rate than what group 3 would. So what's some examples? So group 2, and these are right from some of the groups that we pulled together to be able to have this conversation with some of the representative groups. So this first one is Mechanicsburg Midget Football. Their purpose statement is to serve as a feeder program for the Mechanicsburg High School football and cheerleading programs. That's their mission, directly from their bylaws. The second one, this is directly from the eligibility for swimmers as a part of the Mechanicsburg Swim Club. We are only accepting new swimmers that live in the Mechanicsburg Area School District. Third one, this is actually, I think this is the one from softball, but it's almost the identical one wording from baseball. The only requirement is that you reside or have a a child attending a public or private school within the Mechanicsburg Area School District.
I assume from the middle one that they're grandfathering some people in possibly.
I would assume that
Right.
as well, yeah. So again, very clearly through either eligibility, through mission, through purpose, through their organization, they're making it clear that they're an organization specifically for the Mechanicsburg community. This is in contrast, and the reality is that we have organizations that many of our families are a part of that are very successful and vibrant organizations that have a more regional reach. And those organizations aren't ashamed to say that within their mission and bylaws and within their vision, that they look to be regional organizations pulling families and youth from around our region, whether it be in York or north of us or east or west. They're pulling people from all over, not just the Mechanicsburg area. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's great, and they are very successful organizations, and they should be proud of the work that they're doing. And we want our families to continue to engage with those organizations if that's where their child's passion lies. But ultimately, we can't pretend that something that has a regional reach that's pulling youth and families from all over outside of Mechanicsburg and may have just a percentage of students that are from Mechanicsburg or youth or families that are taxpayers in Mechanicsburg are equivalent to some of these organizations that are saying, you have to live in Mechanicsburg area school district. It's just not the same. So we do believe that there should be a difference there between these groups that we're saying are specifically geared to us in Mechanicsburg, receiving a reduced rate for that reason as Group 2 organizations, and something that may have a more regional or state reach that is an all-other organization that would be in Group 3. So ultimately, that then shifts us to what are the facilities that we're talking about. Some of this we talked through before, so we're going to run through some of this to be able to get to some of the fees, to obviously share that with you as well. Thank you.
So available facilities, I know this was in one of our prior presentations, and frankly, as the board is probably well aware through our conversations about renovation and construction, kind of where we were pre-2018, and then since then, what have we added? I think probably just calling out a few things on this slide in terms of what we've added, the multi-purpose rooms at the elementary schools, the large group rooms, the remodeled media centers, the Wildcat Activity Center. We've rebuilt the swimming pool, renovated the auxiliary gym. And so again, back to kind of the compelling why at the very beginning of the presentation, it was a good time to come back and look at facility use because of the facilities are updated and we've added different spaces. And so that is worthy of a conversation, but also acknowledging that it's also good to go back and look at things like the classifications and what we charge, and look into that here in the next few slides. As a district, and this is not uncommon for school districts, I think it's fair to say as a group, as a district, we're saying there are some inherently unavailable facilities for groups 2 and 3. And so I would say you'll see the common thread, the competition gym, for example, at the high school. And that's pretty typical at other schools. I know even at my prior school that I worked at all those years ago, the high school competition gym wasn't available to be used by outside groups. And we would recommend that's kind of our stance here as well. Weight rooms in both groups 2 and 3, Northside soccer field in both groups 2 and 3, and then the final piece is for group 3, the swimming pool, just because of the nature of the pool and serving the maintenance around it, the lifeguards, all of those pieces. And so that's been struck the other question.
Yeah, why the soccer field? Is it maintenance or?
I was actually just going to point that out. The reason for that is because of the natural surface. In order to keep that for playing conditions, we just can't have the wear and tear on that.
That was my assumption. I just wanted to.
Yeah.
Is that different than what it has been? Have we let people use it in the past, or is that?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, we've been,
So this is just continuing on what we've done in the past.
yeah, I think that's a great question, Mrs. Huffass, and to Dr. Bitz's point, the stuff that's on this list really isn't all that uncommon with what our stance was previously. It's just maybe reaffirming this is kind of as a reminder.
And just as a statement, I mean, and I know originally it was from a gift, and we've since done a lot of maintenance on it, but the benefit to the public of the artificial turf at the stadium and the memorial is amazing. I mean, I live by there. the activity level that has increased there over the past 15, 20 years is amazing. We have another field we don't let people use for the reasons they would not be using the other facility either, had to have a natural turf field.
And there are soccer organizations that use the stadium turf. It's a little bit of a different size, so that's why our PIAA teams don't play on it. It's not the ideal size for a soccer field, but it is within regulation. So there are soccer organizations that currently use Memorial Park, and that's what
So getting a little bit into facility use fees, this was a conversation we had and have had even with our colleagues at other schools, but thinking inherently about what is it about a facility use fee, what's the purpose? And I think one, there's the reservation of the facility, and so you have a little bit of a buy-in that any one group can't say, hey, Mr. Panic, Mr. Hoffman, Mrs. Harrigan, let me just block out the next 100 days on the calendar, and then that might impede other groups from using the calendar, right? And not that that's really happened, because we do try to manage that process, I think, well. But just again, reservation of facilities, recognition of the costs that we have in the facilities, the custodial services that go along with it, in terms of cleanup before or after, letting people in, making sure that they're locked back up again, and then frankly, general facility upkeep. And so I think depending on which part of our facilities you're talking about, some of them have, we re-wax the gym floors, we're replacing the turf every 10 or 12 years, we're upkeeping the pool, and so we have costs in these facilities as a school district anyway. And again, I think to Dr. Bitz's earlier point, none of this is geared toward we're now in the commercial rental business, right? But just that we set our fees appropriately, and that we classify groups correctly, recognizing some of these factors. The other piece is additional service fees as determined by event. And so these aren't necessarily services that we would require for every single group, for every single event, but would really be event specific. And so, for instance, if there's an event at an auditorium and it's a packed house, the parking lot's full, we're probably going to make them have school safety officers. We might even make them have an event manager to be the district's representative in the building on an evening or weekend, just to help manage the event and be a point of contact. Food service personnel, really, that's pretty case specific, but if anyone ever wanted to use our kitchen, it has to be our food service personnel. We don't want our kitchens to be used by outside groups or folks that aren't trained appropriately. Technology personnel, lifeguards, again, pretty event specific technology personnel, events in the auditorium, so forth, and then lifeguards, the swimming pool. But these four categories of an acknowledgement that depending on what's being asked, the groups may pay some fees associated with these additional services.
I'll just point out the only difference here is that we used to have custodial services as a separate fee from the rental fee. We're now looking to include that simply within the typical rental fee for the space rather than being a separate service.
And that would be like, it wouldn't be different for different groups, it would just be.
Well, the fee schedule is different for group 2 than group 3, but it's not delineated as a different custodial charge for.
Correct, that's what I was trying to get.
Just built into
It's building.
And I think just as our facilities, in acknowledgement, they're very nice and they're very well used, and it's benefiting so many people, families and students. But we've also made an investment, even if you think about the staffing side of it, right? We have a custodian who works and then has like a weekend shift as part of that. So they work like Wednesday to Sunday, right? So that we get some coverage on the weekends for events and other things. There's the added benefit of students aren't in, so they can do some additional cleaning. But then we have a maintenance person that's like a mid-shift maintenance that works until 7 o'clock on the evenings, and they work Tuesday to Saturday. And so, again, back to Dr. Britz's point, not that we're not necessarily charging a custodial fee now for every hour of every day the custodians are being, at events and things like that, but rather we'll deploy custodians and maintenance people as needed to open, close, things like that, and support. But also, it's a recognition of the facility use fee, that there is that investment the district's already made, and so some of those facility use fees will help support that investment, frankly. Sorry, the little finicky. The clicker is here. So facility use fees group 2. So as Dr. Bitz said, we have group 1, group 2, and group 3. Before we go so far with group 2, I'll just share group 1, as has been the case, we don't see that as them being charged a facility use fee. Rather, they would just be charged service fees, additional service fees as needed. So really, as we talk about some facility use fee schedules here, we're focusing in on group 2 and group 3. And so facility use fees for group 2, you can see, depending on the facility being used, they vary anywhere from $10 per use up to $50 per use. Again, these are groups there whose mission work is really directly aligned to the school district, and so our intent's not to make a whole lot of money off of like commercial leasing, that type commercial like a leasing type business, but rather some fees to support the operation of our programs. Group 2 continued is also looking at auditorium, cafeteria spaces, media center, but again, fees ranging up to $50 depending on the type of space being used. I'll say that it's a little hard to compare it exactly to our old fee schedules because, as Dr. Bitz said, we had 4, 5, and 6 categories of different groups. I would generally say that if you were in some of those middle categories, they were paying probably $50 per use, maybe in some cases less, maybe multiple uses they were paying 100. So this isn't a very far departure from where we were with some of those middle category organizations. I think the question really then turns to group 3, where we're saying all the other organizations, and I want to make a point here. I think it's probably worth reiterating that Dr. Bitz mentioned earlier. You'll see that we don't have the fee schedule structured in a way that creates like an organic barrier. Some schools, so said another way, some school districts might say, hey, you can use the auditorium or you can use the turf, but it's like $4,000 or $6,000 per use. And so technically you can use it, but from a practical standpoint, it's priced in such a way that no one really is going to use it. And that's not a criticism. I think every school district has to make a decision about how they're using their facilities, where they're pricing them. But this is where we've landed in terms of our facility use fees for group 3. Probably one of the biggest shifts, I would say, from our old schedules is that we've added an acknowledgement that for group 3, there are situations where people might just use it for an hour to 4 hours. And so we've created a column that says, here's where we're at with an hour to 4 hours. It's obviously a little bit of a reduced rate as compared to if someone's using it the full day. I think it's a fair approach based on those groups that are using those facilities. And again, an acknowledgement that 1 hour probably looks different than 8, in terms of what type of custodial services are we providing, or the facility being locked up all day in terms of that one group using it. And so kind of creating that two-tier structure, if you will. And then again, you can see the facilities tiered out based on the nature of the facility and what's available for rental. I will slide over here to the continued same type of premise, auditorium, cafeteria, media center. Again, you can kind of see the tiers based on what space is being used and whether it's being used for maybe a very small part of the day versus the whole entire day. And this is ultimately a recommendation there on fees. But
how many groups do we have there would you would consider currently a group 3? Like, is that 5 or is it 25?
Probably closer to 5, but I don't do
not an
the
exact number. Yeah, not an exact number, but is it a small number or a large number?
Yeah, I'd say 5-ish. I'm trying to like in my mind.
So it's not like
picture.
50 though.
No.
I assume we have a
Yeah.
lot more groups in group 2 than we do in group 3.
Yes.
It's not the norm to have.
And you're expecting those fees in group 2 to pay for a custodian?
Yeah, I think with the group 2 organizations, we know who they are, and I think we don't want I don't know that we want to burden them so much that like if someone's down at the turf and it's a practice for 2 hours, they don't necessarily need the custodian to watch them for 2 hours. They need someone to let them in, let them out, empty the garbage, and so that's been a little bit of a shift in thinking that we want the facilities to be used. We don't necessarily want, because staffing is its own impediment, right? If facilities has to try to assign now for every hour of every day that the facilities are being used by groups, we've got to have a custodian on site. I think it's probably more within the facility process, the request process, where we would say, what's the event, what's happening, is there spectators, an audience, or is it a practice, and we would just assign staff accordingly.
And I think this too.
But we're not paying, we can't afford to pay them for $10.
We're not expecting it to be a dollar for dollar, dollar for dollar surge there. Again, I think with the fees here, there ultimately aren't a whole lot of differences, material differences between the full day rates that you see with Group 3 right now than what we currently have. And really the addition here is that we are acknowledging that there's some availability for groups to use it for just perhaps the morning, and then perhaps a different group can rent it for the afternoon if they wanted to. And both groups shouldn't have to pay the full day rate if they're doing that and splitting the day. The goal here again was not to change fees or make a huge difference there. The goal is equity and fairness, and I believe we're a significant step towards it.
I think the fees are reasonable. There's wear and tear on everything. There's using Memorial Field is not just having someone to go to empty the garbage. They have to go to Memorial Field to empty the garbage.
Right.
And to use the pool doesn't mean, it means you have to turn on the lights and you gotta make sure that it's air conditioned on Saturday and Sunday if that's the day, and that it's not nothing. And it was something that came up when we discussed the school district contribution to the joint rec agreement. It includes the facility use and the fact that the lights stay on for other programs. And so I think this is a fine enough amount without overcharging anybody. But I think you have to acknowledge that it costs the taxpayers money to keep everything in good shape over a long period of time.
I think that's a really good way to articulate. Sorry.
Can you just go back one slide?
Yeah.
I didn't remember seeing the football field. Just,
Turf field.
that's just called, oh,
Yeah, sorry.
sometimes, thanks.
I think it's a good point, and do we get to a point where suddenly we see that something is being used to an extent that the wear and tear is causing us to have additional expense that we have to say, okay, well, this is a facility that we need to up the rate a little bit because it is creating greater wear and tear than what we anticipated. I think that's something for us to keep monitoring.
Couple questions for a board member that's not here tonight.
Yeah.
Just I told him I would bring up if it didn't come up is, so there's no difference, it's all by the facility itself, not the amount of people using it.
Correct.
So if you rent a classroom, whether you have 5 people in there or 25, it's a standard fee.
We would certainly, in the lease agreement, and we do this now, try and help people say, okay, well, how many do you have? Do you really need that spot? Because here's actually a better spot.
But I mean, when you look at the Group 2 pricing, it's really not going to break anybody, whether there's
Correct.
5 people or 25. It's not.
Yep.
They weren't familiar with the cost at the time.
Sure.
The question came up. And on that same notice, particularly for the Group 2 people, is there any way like of in-kind work could be done? Like say from a scouting group to
Yes.
waive those fees is the more serious question if it wasn't had.
So we added that into the policy about in-kind service to the district, and we were very specific about that language of in-kind service. What we see that being is service that the district needs. So I'll give you a couple examples. If an organization reaches out, you mentioned scouting. If scouting reaches out and says, we'd like to spend the day clearing the trail, and then we'd like to have a picnic afterwards at the E-Center. We're not going to charge them for the E-Center picnic because they're also doing some service. So if you are coming to do an active service at the time of your rental, we're not going to charge you for that active service. I think there's other opportunities for if at the time of registration, at the time of setting your dates for the next couple months or whatever the case might be, if you say, you know what, we're going to have a number of service projects within that, is there an opportunity for us to trade off some of that time and instead of paying for 6, we'll pay for 3? You know, I think there's opportunity for us to do that sort of thing as well. Do we want to start running a tab for groups and say, well, 2 years ago we did this over here, so can we do it for free? We don't want to start getting into that, but I think at the time of reservation, to be able to have that conversation of, hey, we're going to do some service in these ways that the district, again, needs, I think it's reasonable. Now, I keep emphasizing that needs because I do foresee us regardless of this, being in a place where we have to have some real conversation about what is a need that someone is providing as an outside organization versus an enhancement or a perceived enhancement. I will just be fully transparent that right now we have a number of dilapidated projects at the environmental center that were built with the best of intentions and were lovely additions to the environmental center, but now are the work of our facilities and rec department to figure out how to rebuild a sundial or rebuild other pieces. So do I think that some of those things are things that we will continue to have at the extent that we currently? I'm not so sure. So I think some of those conversations of what does the district need and how can we help you get to your goal ultimately, because we want to keep having Eagle Scout projects. I'm an Eagle Scout myself. We want to keep doing those and supporting those groups in that way, but making sure that we're doing it with things that the district truly needs, rather than just.
I mean, honestly, I was asking the question for somebody else, but after seeing that fee schedule, I'm not personally so sure. I think it's worth even offering that in kind. It's for the reason you just said. It's where do you draw the line? If you do something for one person, then you're not doing it for the other. I think it's something I personally feel maybe we should think about.
You know, the lacrosse team packed up all of their garbage themselves. Like
Right.
we don't want to pay it. Like I don't know. It's kind of a slippery slope.
Right.
Let me just.
And you will have this available in board docs for those that are away.
Yes, the presentation. So
They'll be able to see it, to see the fee schedules and that.
Yes, yep. And then the fee schedules ultimately don't go into the policy. The fee schedules go into the AR, but they are ultimately published to the public on the website for rentals. So there wasn't really any reason to not share them tonight.
But for those that missed the meeting, they'll be
Yes.
able to see the entire presentation for at least a period of time.
So are there other instructions now out there how you reserve the place and all this, right?
So we have, that was part of the timeline with all this. There are instructions is the short answer to the question. We have not been accepting reservations for the new year in the hopes that this would be tied up for the December 10th meeting and then we would be able to start doing those. We don't see the process changing at all. So just the website in terms of rates would have to get updated.
Is there any, and I don't even know if this is feasible or reasonable, that we will be contacting any of the groups that are typical to tell them, hey, this is updated now, you should go look? Or?
Yes, so we promised to follow up to the other groups that we specifically talked to, and some of those were ones that came to the table. Others were ones that reached out in the weeks since to ask some questions, which were valid questions, and we gathered their feedback just as we did the groups that came. So we will be reaching out specifically to those groups. And then also, I know for a fact that at least the rec department has a little bit of a list of folks that said, hey, as soon as this is tied up, we'd like to do something. So we'll obviously be helping with those folks to get on board too.
Can you go back to, sorry, the slide where you have group 2?
Sorry, Paul, can I? Sorry about
Paul,
that.
sorry, Paul, we need tech help.
I accidentally clicked one too many.
Oh, there, I think that was it, wasn't it? Yes, that one. So can you give me an example of civic organizations when you say
Upper Island Women's Club,
Kiwanis?
Kiwanis, yeah, good examples.
I'm just wondering if anyone would question whether that Kiwanis group reaches beyond the state, beyond Mechanicsburg, and does that differ than what we're looking at in bullet number 1?
So I would see those three as orders. The civic organization has a little bit more definition in the policy where it talks about volunteer organization, probably getting the wording wrong, specifically geared towards service.
Okay, thank you.
So,
And that would not have more specific district requirements about, say, something youth participate in. Correct. Right.
How does PIAA fit in, like when they used our field for when our team was there, but they collected all the ticket money and all that? How's that work?
yeah, that's a great question. I do know that, yes, they collect all the ticket money. We get any of the concession money from those events. We get the opportunity.
Pay all of our staffing fees too.
They
pay for the staff.
Yes, they do pay for the
Oh, out of the
rent.
ticket sales, they pay
But our staff.
our staffing costs.
Yeah, so our security, our ticket takers, all that,
Yeah.
PIAA covers that as well.
But do we charge them rent for that? No,
It's more
because it's
of
our
a-
own team and all that. But what
Well,
if they?
sometimes it isn't.
What
We
about
do-
like
That's what I'm
last
asking.
Friday
We
when
hosted Roman and, I forget who they played. Doesn't matter, but.
it's getting late, I didn't want to ask you, but since it's.
Sorry.
No.
No, I'm curious, just.
I skipped the churches. I'm just gonna get to this one though. So, what, you know.
No, it's really just our way to contribute to PIAA in the same way that we want public schools to do to host our.
So when we host when a PIAA event is held on our property, we're no longer participating, we're the neutral place.
Correct.
We don't charge for that.
I don't believe we charged anything.
And how about when we have band competitions, is that the same? You might actually.
Our
know that's
band's
right.
always there.
So there's, through the competition, the MMA has registration fees for those bands, but we don't have, I mean, our MMA, similar to their Group 1, so they would be paying for school security.
Right.
And those related fees, but not a charge.
Because again, it's something our students participated, or at least did up till they might get knocked out prior to that.
Correct.
So that's even and fair amongst all of those different groups.
PIAA is a good question, and I think to Dr. Bitz's point, there's a little bit expanded definitions probably in the policy, but in the interest of trying to get a summary for the slide, Group 1, we do have a little bit of language also around kind of other governmental organizations and related organizations, and so I think in that way, you could probably, PIAA serves school districts and other, local government, and so I think that probably would be a lens to use.
All right, so getting back to a question I had asked maybe a month or so ago, political.
Yeah, so that piece is still in there. We're recommending that remain in there, that political rallies would not be something we push.
To make
$1 million. Yeah.
$1 million.
And then 04 and 05 will be.
Yeah, so part of the cleanup of this is that rather than having 3 different policies, it's merging all of it together. So the fee schedules are merged together. Again, the groups are the same as opposed to having separate policies for those 2 separate spaces.
So I think that's a good preview of kind of the next steps, if you will. And so looking at what our recommended goals are, consolidating the policies 707, 707-2, 707-3, which is what Mr. Rupp had read into the record earlier this evening, and then recommending updates to policy 707, which is also listed on the agenda for our first reading this evening, and then a second reading possibly being considered on December 10th. And then the final piece is implementation of administrative regulations, which includes that updated fee schedule, which we shared, just because I think that's helpful context to think about alongside the policy itself. So.
And that will continue as an AR. I mean, we don't have, anytime the rates might get raised, we don't have to get involved in that.
That's it.
Any further questions? And everybody feels comfortable moving forward for next month for any further discussion? All right, very good. And with
I
that,
tell you, put a lot of work into it, so thank you.
absolutely, to all of you, all of your departments that did it, and staff. All right, very good. 9.01, meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a